guests. This is the Welcome to the Budget and Performance Committee. This is the first of the meetings to examine the Mayor's budget for the 1920 financial year. As you know, there will be a series of meetings where we look at different component parts of the budget this side of Christmas, and there is space for some more if required after Christmas. Today we're looking at the GLA core budget for 1920. Item 1 is apologies for absence and Chairman's announcements. We are almost all present. I understand that Assemblymember Desai is en route. Okay. Item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations that members wish to make besides those listed in the papers?
No.
Thank you. Item 3 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of September 2018. Are you content that I sign them? Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the report?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5, which is the main item for today. Can I welcome our guests? And I think helpfully they're in order. So can I thank Sarah Mulley, Interim Executive Director of Communities and Intelligence, Emma Strain, can I welcome her, the Interim Executive Director of Communities and Intelligence, Martin Clarke, well known to us all, the Executive Director of Resources, the Mayor's Chief of Staff, David Bellamy, our new Chief Officer, welcome to your first of these sessions, Mary Harpley, Lucy Owen, who is the Interim Executive Director of Development, Enterprise and Environment. Welcome, Lucy. And, of course, David Lunts, who is the Executive Director of Housing. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for your time. As is traditional in these occasions, we're sort of scene setting initially, and, as usual, that falls to me for the earliest questions. So, firstly, to you, David, what were the hardest choices that you faced going into this year's budget?
I think just looking, obviously, at this stage at the GLA mayoral budget, I think the hardest choices were about how we ensure that we continue to deliver the Mayor's agenda and pursue and achieve as much as we can for London, whilst operating within the constraints that have been set out, and that we're not growing the net spend of the GLA. Of course, the Mayor's priorities have been established in his two previous budgets, and what this budget does is it reflects the continuing work in those areas, and in particular the Mayor's focus on tackling London's housing crisis. Our affordable housing programme is by far the largest since the GLA was created, and we're working towards a level of affordable home building in London that I'm told hasn't been seen in London in my lifetime. The Mayor's Housing Capital programme has grown from around about £4 billion just over a year ago to what next year will be about around £7 billion. This is both due to extra money the Mayor has won from government, but also other investment, for example, the £300 million enterprise zone in the Royal Docks. So the draft revenue budget provides for the additional staff needed to manage this huge delivery programme, and in turn the support services they need. It also proposes an additional £1 million to tackle rough sleeping, undoubtedly an issue of widespread concern to Londoners, whilst, as I say, not requiring any extra funds from taxation.
Okay, thank you. Some of that we're going to pick up as we go along, particularly the housing element of that. Does the budget reflect any changing in priorities? We're 3 years, or this is the third budget of the Mayor's administration, so have priorities changed or developed over that time?
I don't think I would say that priorities have particularly changed or developed. It's about how we ensure we make the best use of the funds in each individual area, and also, as I say, about how we secure more money externally where we can to achieve even more in those areas.
What efficiencies have been made in the GLA compared with last year?
So there's a table of savings set out in the budget document, which comes to some £3 million. On top of that, in terms of efficiencies, I'd probably pick out 3 areas. The first is our policy of not inflating programme budgets. So they're frozen each year despite inflation, and I'm advised that's equivalent to an efficiency of around £2.8 million. Second area, I would say, is looking at our evolving approach to IT. Clearly, as the organisation grows and time goes on, and we know how the world changes, there's more and more data generated and has to be retained by the organisation. We were coming up to the point where an investment of £1 million was going to be needed in extra storage capacity for all that information, and we've managed to avoid that, but through our change in approach and using storage in the cloud, and obviously gradually moving across to use some of the storage we get within the licensing we have with Microsoft, and so that leads to an efficiency. And then the final thing, which in some cases colleagues who members of the Oversight Committee will be cited on, will be some of the staffing decisions that have been taken in the last year. For instance, the changes to business support and external affairs, or the reduction in 2 in the number of assistant directors in the authority.
The £3 million of savings that you referred to, the biggest item or the biggest efficiency by far is the CNI Directorate Programme budget, which was over-programmed or over-budgeted for, to the tune of around about £1.4 million. What does that £1.4 million represent as a percentage of the overall total, and what were the causes of it?
Well, this is David reaching for the budget document. The CNI budget, I've got a figure of about 70 million in my head. But that includes obviously a number of one-off items, and so the recurring level of spend is more about 45-46 million pounds. Testing my memory, yeah, that's not too bad actually. So yeah, you can do the percentage figures.
Relatively small. What was the cause of the over-budgeting? Is it over-estimating staffing or what?
Can I refer to my colleagues on that?
Can I write you the detailed breakdown?
Yeah, that'll be fine. I mean, we'll do the usual form, Martin, so we'll write to all of you afterwards, and we'll pick up issues.
We do have analysis of all the variances, and I think it'd be good to set it out exactly.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to... Assembly Member DeVal's indicated he's got a supplementary on this point, and then I've got some questions I'd like to ask Mary Harpley. So, Assembly Member DeVal.
And just from your the budget report and the questions that you've answered, without going into detail, because we've got some detail on specific sections of the core budget, there's a combination of reductions, planned reductions coming off in some of these budgets. It's not clear whether some are due to government cuts, some are due to programmes coming to an end, or you're reprioritising finances. Combination. Is there a strategy in this budget for all three of those? Is that what you're doing? Is that what's happening generally? I just want to ask that generally about the budget approach and some of the questions about your priorities. Because just looking at some of where the budget is heading for various sections, I'm slightly at a loss for the reason of that. So I'd like just generally about overall in terms of the strategy for the core bits of this budget, the bit we're dealing with today, what's the thinking and where is it?
So I think the approach we try to take is saying, okay, we have a certain amount of money allocated to each area, and then we want to look for that area to propose how to use that, and use that in the most effective way to achieve the outcomes the Mayor's trying to obtain. And obviously this then all ties through with the performance monitoring we've talked about previously. And then it's a question of saying, well, right, how is that area going? Does it need all that money to achieve that? If something's going and is going really well, can we scale up project X? Maybe project Y is not going so well, and we can transfer money. If we see that actually we need more money than we thought to deliver the desired outcome in a particular area, then the question is, do we need to move money from one area to another to do that and make those choices? I think what I would say in general to your point about following that, one of the things I think you see in the budget document is late last year there were, due to the additional business rates income, there are a number of decisions made about additional expenditure by the GLA. The most obvious example of that is the Young Londoners Fund, and that obviously causes in the first year or two a boost to the figures there. You can definitely see it in the C&I figures, and what you don't perhaps necessarily see, because the GLA budget was set so shortly after that decision was made, was the profiling of that spend over a number of years. And so one of the things that I think we'll need to try and do is show how that profiling actually works, and then you can actually see where is that particular stream actually coming to an end in terms of its expenditure.
And without going into specifics, I see it in some sections of the core budget, and I understand that. So I see that in housing and land. I don't see that clarity in some of the other budgets of what you're trying to do. Am I being unfair in making that comment?
I think the difference between housing and land and possibly the other directorates, certainly CI, is that housing and land is very much more a capital programme directorate, and so you have that visibility on the capital programme and the physical things that are happening. C&I is obviously not so much about capital, it's more about revenue.
No, let me explain. It's not. It's much far more simpler than that.
Okay.
It's a difference between, if I can't spend it on that area, or I've got different choices for different products, then I can see it moving around. And I see that clearly in what you're trying to do. In the other budgets of where you're reprofiling, I'm not sure if I see that clarity. I don't see where, as programmes come to an end, whether it is programmes coming to an end, or is it because government funding is coming to an end. I need clarity about why certain decisions, what's driving you in terms of taking those decisions. When we come into it, Chair, if we may, when we get up specifics, maybe you'll tell us where there are reductions in budgets, where you can point to whether it's a government cut, whether it's a reprioritisation, a strategic decision that you're going to move that money, or a programme coming to an end that does it. That's the bit I'm asking for, in the clarity of that.
Yeah.
So when we come to do the specifics, there may well be some more questions on the back of that.
I understand that, and I think let's just say as a general point, that's exactly where we want to drive. I mean, obviously it's the budget process, but it's where we want to drive to in terms of performance monitoring, that it's not just about, right, where are we on against this particular target and this particular deliverable, but it's also about setting out, right, well, what is the budget spend in this area, and then the projects in that area, and getting that transparency there, and that's something that we absolutely want to achieve.
Okay.
So Assemblymember Hall, and then we're going to come back to the questions that
It's only a very quick one, if I may. When you were asked what efficiencies you were making, you mentioned staffing decisions and reducing support. Can I ask how many people work at the GLA?
So my recollection from the last workforce report is that 953 people.
953 people in post at the end of September.
And that includes contract workers as well, does it?
That will include everybody in a post that's recognised in our establishment, and agency staff filling posts that are temporary, that are vacant. It won't necessarily recognise every contractor who is working here in the building. It'll depend on why they are here. But if they are filling recognised posts in the organisation, they will be counted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions to you, Mary. The corporate management team has got a new budget line in here, and there's a couple of areas of spend in it that we're quite interested in. The first is the transformation budget, the transformation fund, the £1.5 million transformation fund. What will it deliver?
Well, its main focus is to make sure that we've got a sustainable way of working as an organisation going forward, that I suspect will allow us to either stabilise our costs or reduce them. That's the summary. One of the reasons that there's not that much detail against it at the moment is, as you know, I've only been here a few weeks, but one of the things that's very clear to me already is that we are constrained for space here. We are using technology well, but not as well as we might, I think. And we have a whole raft of sort of underpinning work around HR policies and other policies that we need to think about how are we going to work in the future across City Hall and Union Street in a way that allows us to live within whatever footprint we agree we're going to live within, but work most effectively taking into account the way the world is these days, the way technology enables us to work, the way people expect to work. So it's really, we've called it Transformation Fund because it's sort of defined by how, what is the way the staffing body supports the Mayor's Office and the Assembly, how best to organise those teams and how best to enable them to work as effectively as possible.
Okay, the budget itself, the document refers to development and implementation of talent attraction and management strategies and to address key workforce issues identified in the staff survey. What does that mean?
Well, so there are three main areas identified in the staff survey, which, as you know, is over a year old now. The first is around reward and recognition. The second is around how we can ensure that our staff can work effectively and with the right eye to staff's well-being, as we must have. And the third area is how we move towards a more diverse and more inclusive workforce. The Transformation Fund will help us move a long way against each of those areas. So if I take to your point around the attraction and talent management strategies, we do need, and are already thinking hard about how we make sure that when we go out to recruit, we are making sure that we are seen as an attractive employer with, rewarding roles right across the demographic of the city. And we haven't always thought in that way. I think we've thought about, well, we've got this role here, we generally know how we recruit to it, we'll carry on in that same way. But, as we know from the workforce reports that you see regularly at Oversight, there are aspects of our workforce that are not as diverse as we need them to be. And you only start doing that by making sure that people feel attracted to the GLA and to the jobs that we have on offer. Once we have people here, we need to be able to progress people, make the most of the talent that we bring in, and maximise that for the organisation by offering progression opportunities. And again, there are some very good examples of people progressing here within the GLA, but we know that probably at the moment we don't pay enough attention to that side of our sort of responsibilities to our staff.
Okay, so the £1.5 million assigned to this line then, what will it actually be spent on?
What will it be spent on? Well, it will be spent on a mixture of things. It will be spent on partly buying in some specialist help, probably temporarily, to help us develop what is our proposition to people that we're looking to recruit, for example. Some of that work has already started. It will be spent partly on staff dedicated, for example, to the technology question. Where do we want to go with technology? What are other organisations doing? What do we need here in terms of infrastructure and devices? We'll need some specialist help with that.
So we're probably looking at contractors for this, are we?
Well, we're probably looking at some contracted help, but I think this isn't a programme that's going to be completed in a few months. This is a programme that this is a programme that that is going to morph into business as usual, because it's about where we need to be in the future, and not in the fairly imminent future. So it might be that we bring on some staff into the via the Transformation Fund in pretty much permanent roles. But what we need to think about is, well, how does that then morph into what our HR team looks like and what our technology group team looks like in the future? you'll see in the document we did try and distinguish between there are some immediate needs, particularly in TG and HR, around getting over some sort of lumps of work that need to be done. But then there's some future thinking to be done. And I think at the moment, as I see it, we don't have enough capacity for some of that future thinking. So I don't necessarily see it all being contracted, because actually we need people designing the future, living with us in the future as well. But you know, I'm very happy to come back either here or into oversight with more detail of that. But
No, that's
it's
fine.
a mix, is the answer to your question.
Okay. I mean, we will be obviously keeping an eye, and we'll pick that up either, as you say, here or in oversight later on. The other thing that caught my eye is the London Watchkeeper service that you are proposing, which is 9 members of staff for a 24/7 rota to really keep people informed about potential disruptive incidents. How do you see that working?
And David and I are going to do a double act on that, if that's okay.
Fine.
Yeah. I think, Chair, it's probably just worth saying that, slightly limited about what can be said about some aspects of this in public, but there is a private briefing of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee, on which I know 3 of you sit, being arranged to go into it in more detail. The background really is that as administration, we've placed great emphasis on building strong working relationships with the National Security Secretariat and the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, which has been hugely beneficial, in particular when COBRA has been invoked following a terrorist attack. And so this budget proposal then is to address 2 related items. First, provision of suitable facilities related to COBRA. Second, ensuring that London Government is aware of what's going on across the city in order that we can meet our public responsibilities. That probably breaks down into 2 areas. The first is you look at the GLA. The GLA currently has a duty officer who, in addition to their normal responsibilities, is on call 24/7 to be alerted to any new or developing incidents in London. The experience of the last 2 years has shown us that this model is just not sustainable. There are simply too many incidents, including protests and false alarms, and social media, of course, means that they're all in the public eye, for one person to deal with this reactively, especially given the high number that fall outside business hours and the prolonged workloads that results when they occur. Secondly, London boroughs operate a resilience coordination system known as London Local Authority Gold, whereby London-wide responsibility is assigned to a borough chief executive each week. Recent discussions have identified a lack of information available to that person, and indeed that councils are often unsighted on developments in neighbouring boroughs that are impacting on them and their residents. So, therefore, in the budget, funding is being sought for a 24/7 watchkeeper service that, using a range of public and private data feeds, can monitor what's going on in London, ensure that the relevant people, both at the GLA and in the boroughs, are alerted and kept informed, and also provide a clear flow of information during an incident. This proposal is based on the government's approach and learning from how they do this, and they're strongly supportive of this being established in London. Discussions are underway both as to the nature of the service and the contributions that would be payable by others, and the allocation proposed in the draft budget is very much reflective of the work done to date.
9 people proposed to carry out this function. Are they new people, or are they contained within existing staffing resources?
So there will be new people, because beyond somebody doing it as an adjunct to their existing job, there's nobody there. Obviously, what's important to understand is that this is about a 24/7 service, and so you only will have a couple of people working at any one time, but necessarily to have the cover that's needed, you need that volume of people.
Okay. Back to Mary again, because the transformation programme is the largest new activity in the GLA's revenue budget, and it entails 17 new posts. 9 of them were just established after the watchkeeper service. What are the other 8?
So, at the moment, and as I said, this is a fairly early thinking. The other 8 are at the moment likely to be 4 roles related to the question of future technology. the equivalent of, and 4 roles related to the whole HR underpinning HR questions about ways of working, what expectations we set of people, how we decide, the policies around if you're going to have a more dispersed, flexible workforce, which we're going to need if we're going to be able to work within the footprint that we have. There are all sorts of questions that arise about choices that you make about who works at home when, or where people are allowed to work, what you demand in terms of continuing one-to-one interaction, what you demand in terms of ongoing team meetings. There's a whole raft of policy work that needs to be done, and thinking about that. We also need to have a conversation with everybody about how this might work, how Assembly members feel about that, because this would potentially affect teams in the Secretariat, how the Mayor's office feel about that, how Deputy Mayors
Sorry,
feel
could
about
you
that.
just speak up, because I'm finding you very hard to hear.
Sorry,
And you said you want to have a conversation with Assembly members about what? I didn't hear you.
Am I not being picked up by the microphone?
You're very quiet.
Okay.
Or I'm very,
I can hear you, but I think...
or I'm very deaf, one or the other.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
Mary, as you're new here, there are some strange acoustics in this chamber
Okay.
sometimes.
Okay. So the point I'm making is, before we start making some of these changes about ways of working, we need to have a conversation in the organisation about what those changes should be, with what benefits, with Assembly members as well as the Mayor's office. That was my point about Assembly members.
Okay.
So we need resource to be able to staff some of that work. But as I've already said, that's not necessarily jobs that we need for a long time.
So in summary, the 17 new staff in your team will be 9 people for the London Watchkeeper service, 4 HR policy people and 4 IT people.
Yes. So the 9 watchkeeper, I think, is certain, because that proposal was well under development by the time I arrived. The 4 plus 4 represents the current thinking on the type of resource that we would need for the programme, but there is more work to be done to around the details of the programme.
Okay, I saw Assembly Member Deval.
So, I wasn't going to speak on this section. Some of you might be happy to know, but I think I need to. Here we are in the budget process, and I realise that you're new, but this is new to us in terms of that. Now, forgive me, because I'm a bit cynical. Transformation fund means to me an exit policy for some people. Then I listened carefully to what you said, and it's obviously a bit more. So I think, as a matter of urgency, we need some flesh on this proposal before anyone can support in terms of the movement towards it, and we need it very quickly. In terms of what you've told us about this, I would say this, and it's not the job of this committee, but in terms of the new watchkeeper service, and I think it's commendable that we've done some research that says, and we tried to mirror in terms of where government is going, but unless there are the processes that oversight did look at, another committee looked at, that run alongside that, I'm not sure about this investment either. And I think I'd like to understand what those processes will be that will run alongside, that brings us back into conformity, because I think there were some issues raised by oversight, particularly post-Grenfell, about what was going on in this building and the way that it behaved. So I'm quite supportive of those issues, but unless we see the detail that runs alongside it and about the mechanisms and regimes that we are to relate to our other partners in this city in times of woe, I'm not sure in terms of that investment in the way it's been described is going to be neat, because if we don't do that, it just won't be effective. And so I think these are 2 areas of expenditure, relatively small in the scale of things, but relatively important in their own ways, about the future of this organisation and the stance it takes. So as a matter of urgency, really, I don't really want to wait for oversight to delve in it or in this budget. I think we'd like something a bit more fleshed out ASAP as we start going through this budget process. We're going to be talking to the other parties within the GLA budget before Christmas. So actually before Christmas would be a good deadline for you to focus on, where you can provide that information, I think.
Can I just... Okay,
If I may first, David, because it strikes me, I've got two suggestions of how we could satisfy that, and maybe you can chip in as well. Either we could potentially invite all members to attend the Fire Resources and Emergency Panel private briefing if the chair of that committee would be amenable to it. Or potentially, Mary, you could write to committee members setting out a bit more flesh on the bones on your proposals. Did you want to add to that, Dave?
So your first point you make about the private briefing that's what I was going to suggest as well. I'm sure that would be very sensible if the chair's amenable to that. In terms of the transformation fund, I think the point I just wanted to make was just to agree with Assembly Member Duval about the urgency. Yeah, I walked through the Mayor's office yesterday morning, and somebody was unable to log in and they couldn't get through to TG on the phone. And the reality is that there are a lot of incredibly good people in that team working incredibly hard, and the demand they are seeing is meaning that colleagues are not getting the service they should get, and we need fairly urgently to give the leaders in that area the space to actually be able to step out of the firefighting and actually start addressing these issues, because thinking back to my experiences of IT support in the private sector, some were good, some were bad, but some of the good bits were where there were some things that were automated and I could self-serve and I didn't need assistance from a human to solve my problem, and that obviously takes a bit of investment to set up, but then it's a much more efficient way of working. And the point about this is that we need the capacity so that we can get in and do that stuff, and it will pay back over time.
I just want to say this. On the two areas that you've highlighted, for a number of years, I've been very critical of their performance. So in terms of HR, when you talk about adding staff to HR, albeit we have a new head of HR, which is quite good in that sense, because I was critical of the previous head, and be quite honest about that. The performance of HR has been a running sore of this organisation, not just for in terms of the London Assembly, but for the rest of the organisation. So unless you start having your listening ears on about it, but IT in this place, both HR and IT have been protected during these budget processes in previous years. Right? They have not had to suffer any of the efficiency issues, as far as I'm concerned, that others have had to do in this building. There is a performance issue per se, but if you're telling me you have to spend money at that rather than a management approach to it, that's why I think I want, as a matter of urgency, to see where your breakdown of this transformation issue is and about how do we deal with it. Because I think there are some real issues that have been festering for some time and need dealing with in terms of performance.
I think we've got Mary's commitment to focus on these areas. Clearly, this is what this is about. I just would note that I'm told in 2017 there were 3 times as many IT service requests as in 2011, and they expect this year the number to be double what it was in 2016. So if we see issues in team performance, that's got to be at least part of the reason why, and that's why I think it is so important and so urgent that Mary and her team get to work on this.
Right.
So, I agree, it's very urgent. I do think there's investment needed before we'll see the capacity to change. But, that's what I'm partly here to do. And I will write to you very urgently with there is already more detail behind the plans than you have in last week's budget document. So they're developing quickly, and I will write with urgency to the committee.
Okay. I've seen Assembly Member Hall, and then we're going to move on to another section. Assembly Member Hall.
A very quick point, please. Mary, you mentioned making it a more attractive place to work and all the rest of it. Do we have problems then recruiting staff?
So we have had some problems recruiting staff in some areas. That's true. Do we have a problem recruiting overall? I don't think so. You know, we have a churn rate, a rate of people leaving of about 16% every year. That's a reasonable rate. So it means we have to do quite a lot of replacing of people. I think the bigger issue is the diversity of the applicants that we attract to our roles, and then therefore the diversity of the long list and short list as we go through the recruitment process. I think that's a bigger issue than attracting people full stop.
But in general, we don't have a problem recruiting.
I think, with the exception of some teams where we have been running some vacancies for some time.
All right, thank you.
Well, we're going to move on to another section because one of the most interesting developments in the budgeting in this place, of course, is the business rates situation. And Assembly Member Val is going to lead us through that.
Okay, so how are we doing on the business rate pilot? What's the assessment of it? I think it's to you, David, this question. How do you think it's performing and where do you think it's going?
Okay, so there's probably two questions there, aren't there, in terms of 2018-19 and then the future. So in terms of 2018-19 first, so what the pilot has allowed is that across London Government, clearly not just the GLA, but it's allowed us to retain an estimated additional £350 million of revenues, which otherwise would have gone to the government to use as they saw fit. Around half of that total is agreed with the government would be applied to fund strategic investment, the things that would lead to increases in growth and hopefully increases in business rate income in future and try and boost the economy, get into a virtuous circle. And so that was broken down into £112 million, which was for the Mayor to allocate, and then I think around £52 million, which was a joint pool for allocation by agreement between the Mayor and London boroughs. So the initial distribution decisions have been made on those. The Mayor so far has taken decisions to allocate 91 million of the 112, and from the London-wide pot, there's a decision to allocate 49 million, with a bit held in contingency there in case the final outturn numbers are not quite as strong as expected. In terms of the Mayor, that money breaks down into four real areas. The first is commercial development in opportunity areas and providing the support there as those areas grow. That's around £60 million of investment. The second is affordable housing delivery, recognising how crucial that is to sustaining London's economy. £14 million of investment there. Then further 6 million on support for local economies and small businesses, and finally around 10 million to support London's industrial strategy. And so those decisions are all in place, and regarding the last 20 million pounds or so, there's some work being done to refine a few of the bids, and hopefully in a few weeks we'll be able to go to the Mayor for a decision about that.
And just on that mechanism of where you jointly agree, so it works both ways, I presume. So the Mayor gets to talk about where London local government wants to spend its money, and they get to talk about where you want to spend your money. Is that how it works, or is it just your money? It's
not quite. The money, the £52 million is a joint decision between the Mayor and London boroughs, and there's a governance agreement that does that. The £112 million, obviously boroughs are free to talk about it as a benefit that's come to London from the deal that we together agreed with government, but it's entirely the Mayor's decision where that's spent.
Yep.
Just as the other money that boroughs receive, it's entirely their decision on where to spend that in terms of their own local services.
So where does the 52 million go then in terms of that? Just you described some of the priorities of where you're spending it in terms of that, but where of the 52 million, what's jointly been decided by boroughs and the Mayor? And also, if the boroughs, because they're under a lot of pressure, if the boroughs are pushing back, and say they don't want to play this game anymore, would that delay the allocation of that spending?
So I don't have the detailed list of the joint borough mayor allocations in front of me. I know from the top of my head that some of them were in terms of digital investment and trying to, looking at how we can speed the rollout of fibre in certain areas. There were other kind of, business incubator type things and a range of schemes that obviously, a good mix in terms of the type of thing they're doing and also their location across London. And that comes in, so the governance mechanism, what that requires is, firstly, the mayor has to agree. The mayor essentially has a veto as half of London government, if you like. And then amongst the boroughs, from memory, they need, and Martin will correct me if I'm wrong, they need two-thirds support. But if any sub-region of boroughs, all of them were opposed, then that would prevent a proposal going forward. If such a situation happened, then basically the money would just be held back, and then there would be a further bidding round a few months later to hopefully try and address some of those concerns. Obviously, what I'm pleased to say is that whilst there were more bids from boroughs into that pot than there was money available, so inevitably there were some losers. There was wide support for the decisions that were made and the recommendations that came from, it was an independent panel of officers from across London boroughs and also the GLA as well.
What are the areas that the London boroughs push back on then, or have there been, or has it all been going okay and everyone's in agreement?
So the proposal from the committee that was sent out for consultation, was supported and approved as set out. As I say, I'm sure there will be some pockets of disappointment where individual boroughs didn't get their specific pet project through, but I think there was a general recognition, I don't know, Martin, if you want to say more, but general recognition that it was a fair proposal.
All of that is, all the successful bids is where more than one borough had come together in putting forward a bid. So I'm only sort of aware of one borough particularly disappointed, but they only put a bid in, they were the sole partners. I think all the other bids had more than one borough, and I think they all were also leveraging other funding from other partners as well. And I think it's on that basis, that's why there was broad support.
And do we know what that ratio of leverage is?
I have got it.
Is there a officer stance that if you're going to get this money, this is what you need to leverage in from other partnership funds to access this money?
Part of their criteria, more weight would be given to collective bids, including other boroughs and other partners. I haven't got the detail to hand, but I do have the information, the breakdown of the successful bids, which I'd be happy to provide.
Okay, so against this background of this spend, of course, business rates is quite contentious in London. The government has given some commitments and issues around that. What discussions have we had with government about any reimbursements if they decide to support lowering of business rates or issues of that, or do we just accept that it goes down and we have a reduced pot?
To date, every time the Chancellor or the Department have made an announcement to provide further reliefs or exemptions, the government then have reimbursed local government by specific grant. So if they increased small business rates relief, all the authorities across the country then get reimbursed pound for pound by extra grants.
Okay, but you accept there is pressure there, isn't there, and that the government will want to respond, and it may actually not be they may come up with, post-Brexit, some further incentives to support business who might well be struggling in a downturn. Are we able to cope with that if a big issue comes and the government says, thank you very much, we're not going to give you what we normally done?
Well, that's it's obviously it's a bit of a theoretical question. The government do hold the policy
So
levers.
what's plan B? I don't think that's a theoretical. If there is an issue about you don't have the money to spend, what would be plan B?
Well, the fundamental security the GLA has, it retains a business rates reserve to cover uncertainties and volatility over business rate levels, and,
Okay.
and we hold it to cover the risk across the GLA group.
And that's standing at 163 million?
It should be, no, 182, I think.
Sorry?
It's 100, or is it 186? It's a bit higher than you say, from memory, I think.
It's in the
There is
table.
money. Is this the same reserve that's set aside if you challenge, for challenges of business rates where people are not satisfied by the rates they pay? Is that the same fund that you're referring to?
For appeals, there is a provision on the balance sheet for that.
What do we think that is? Is it my figure or your figure?
It's the sum of every borough's provision that the GLA puts. I think it's in the order of, I'll have to check, in the order in the 300 million line
Oh,
for
that's
appeals.
300 million.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I mean, I think, so this whole question of I guess the fundamental point of your question is, the GLA budget is based on a level of council tax and business rates, because that's fundamentally our income sources. Yeah. We obviously take a prudent approach around business rates because it is uncertain how much money we will get. Council tax, the uncertainties are lower. Clearly, there's a lot of conversation about the future of business rates, the state of the high street, the Amazons of the world doing things from areas where business rates are much lower. And that raises questions. There are then questions about the level of business rate retention and things like that. Ultimately, if the government takes a decision, then we're bound by that. If the government were to decide, well, fundamentally, the mayor is going to have more money or the mayor is going to have less money, then ultimately that's a decision for the government and Parliament, and we have to deal with it. As Martin says, we have resources to manage the situation, manage transition, but ultimately we're dependent on the decision of the government in terms of funding.
But our risk is capped because the government does have a safety net. So if your business rates reduce below a certain level, government support kicks in. So our business rates reserve covers the gap between the floor, you could say, and what we're expecting, to allocate across the group.
Thank you.
Okay, so Assembly Member Pidgeon, and then we're going to move on.
Sort of quick question. I think it might have been in a press release. In terms of the strategic investment pot, the Mayor claimed that this initial investment will leverage in over 4 times as much investment from other sources. Are you able to give us detail how that has been arrived at and what the evidence is to back that up, please?
I suspect, looking at my list, most of the things where the leverage is there are in the individual projects that haven't yet been announced. We've got a couple that are big ones that are going to be announced next month, and that will be part of that. There were smaller examples, but things that were announced around space for creative industries in Clapham and also in Deptford, where this was only part funding, and so there was match funding on those projects to enable them to proceed. So that would be one example. And I think some of the others are some of the bigger announcements that are yet to come.
Perhaps in a few weeks, as you do that announcement, you could put that detail in writing. It's interesting to understand the benefits from this.
Yeah. I think it would be best trying to come back at some point in the new year on that. So but we've certainly taken out to do that.
Okay, fine. We're going to move on now to look at the Development, Enterprise and Environment Department. So, Lucy, you're up. Firstly, we're going to start with Environment, and Assemblymember Cooper's going to lead on that.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, there's some big changes planned for that you're budgeting for next year, and I just wondered if we could unpack that a bit as to why you're suggesting these changes. There's a drop on the revenue side of over 4 million, 4.4 million, which is almost a 30% decrease in the environment budget. And I think the environment has been a success for the Mayor. Why are you planning to reduce it so much? And if you reduce it so much, how on earth can you keep the momentum going on some of the things that the team has been doing?
I can see why you think there's a reduction there, but in reality, there's no planned reduction in spend. What that reduction is made up of is there was a number of one-off expenditure which was put into the budget last year through additional business rates. So there was around 6 million that was put in as one-off, which is why the budget for this financial year looks larger. Some of that still needs to be profiled to be spent in further years. So just examples of what some of those were. There was one-off growth of air quality of 1 million. There was one-off growth to support drinking water fountains to reduce plastic waste of 2 million. There was one-off growth to support national park cities of 3 million.
Okay, this is on the revenue side we're just talking
This is on the revenue.
I'm going to come on to capital in a minute. So
yeah.
definitely we're talking about 2 million on the revenue side for the water fountain rollout.
Yes, I mean some of that needs to be reprofiled, and there might be capital revenue swaps, but that's where it sits in the budget.
2 million sounds quite high for revenue spend on water fountains. I mean, that seems to be higher than the amount you've now got profiled into the budget for the capital
There
spend.
is some profiling that needs to be done, because when the money was put in, we didn't know the split exactly of what was going to be revenue and what was going to be capital. We can write to you with that reconciliation of what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I
to go
think
through
that would
the
be
details.
quite interesting.
Yeah, we can give you all the details of that. We've got all that, but that's where it looks like reduction, but it was actually one-off growth from the financial year. So from the previous years, there's no planned reduction.
Okay, so you're saying that there's
budget.
no reduction. It's been the removal of some one-off
growth,
amounts of money.
And a small amount of carry forward from the previous year as well.
Okay. And so you don't foresee that there will be any problem with the momentum of keeping all of the different initiatives going?
No.
But on the
and
capital
we're planning to do what we did before.
Okay, but on the capital side, there's also some reductions. I accept, of course, that there's the Greener City Fund looks as though you're putting an extra £1 million into that. And on the drinking fountains, that's gone from naught on capital to 1.26 million. So obviously those are both very welcome. And the announcements about the rollout of the network of water fountains is obviously crucial for Londoners, and particularly as also the climate is changing. It's not just in terms of plastic reduction. So very pleased to see that. However, slightly concerned that it appears that your capital budget in the environment side is going to go to 0 for air quality, and it appears to be going to 0 for energy supply, and it seems to be being reduced by about 2 million for home energy efficiency projects and by about the same amount for the commercial energy efficiency projects. What's going on there, and why is that happening, and isn't that going to have a bit of an impact again?
For the next financial year, again, we're looking to maintain as much as we can on the Greener City Fund. There's been a swap from capital to revenue. I won't go into details of if it's one tree, it's revenue. If it's a load of trees, it's capital. But anyway, Martin can explain all that to you.
Well, it's looking to me like it's a swap from revenue to capital.
There's some of that that's happened. On air quality, the most of the budget sits in revenue for the GLA, but the majority of the spend is via TfL. So there's around 800 million per annum, which comes from TfL. So that's where the majority of the
Sure,
the work
I understand that, which is why I said the environment budget for air quality, because I was being quite specific, because I do understand that there's money sitting within the TfL budget for air quality measures. But obviously you did have a budget of almost £1 million here that appears to be going. And is that work that is now completed and finished, and we don't need that money anymore?
Yeah, it is work that has been completed. So the work that was done on air quality with the capital was specifically for, let me just find the exact detail of what that was for. There was some, just need to get the detail. There was some specific work that was done for one-off funding for audits, after the audits that were done at nurseries and schools.
This is the
there
school
was-
audits.
Yeah, there was
Okay.
money provided to for trials to post those audits for measures which
Mitigation
could be
measures.
put into place, which would then take forward some of the mitigations.
So the audits are complete, and you're saying that all of the mitigation measures have now been installed everywhere that we were planning to install them?
So the money is going out the door. I can get an update for you exactly where we are on those.
Well, I
But
think
yes,
that would be
we're
very
privy-
welcome,
we're privy to
because
that, yeah.
a lot of members get contact from local schools. We also visit them, and it would be very welcome to know
Yep.
exactly what the money is being spent on. And also, is there going to be some sort of post-installation monitoring of those mitigation measures so that we can assess which measures are most
Yes.
efficient? That's something that a lot of people do raise with me. And, you know, is a green wall or a green roof that's been put
Yes.
into a school better than planting hedges? Are you planting different hedges between the playground and the busy road? Which hedge is best to plant? Are we going to be assessing that?
Yes, yeah, that's the reason for that, to
Okay,
discover, yeah.
so there will be some revenue funding that will continue for some sort of analysis to be done.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Now, obviously, we were hopeful that we might get some money from central government for boosting recycling, and it looks as though the money has not come in from. Looks like Mr. Hammond was being very unkind to us. So, in terms of boosting recycling, what is the Mayor going to do without this additional 100 million that was applied for? And also, I'd like to hear about what's going on food waste, with particular reference to Barnet.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's obviously an area in terms of boosting recycling that's quite important. Getting people to segregate food waste really helps. What are we doing to encourage people and support councils, particularly where concerns have arisen?
So, as you know, the Mayor's set very ambitious targets for London to reach 65% of its waste being recycled by 2030 and a 50% reduction in food waste by 2025. And you're right, but boroughs do need government support to do that. So, for example, we need investment in recycling services. Local government cuts mean boroughs need much more funding for this. And the budget was a missed opportunity to give these much needed funds. So I agree with you there. In London, we estimate that we need more than 100 million to meet the 2025 recycling target. Although it wasn't provided in the budget, we are looking at the spending review to help secure an increase in funding. And we're lobbying for changes such as the plastic tax and extended producer responsibility, which could make more funding available. We've got the forthcoming government consultation on the new resources and waste strategy. It will cover some of those issues, and we're going to respond to that consultation with a clear message that then more needs to be done, and we need to develop a mechanism whereby finances generated from extended producer responsibility are made available to help fund local authorities. But in the meantime, we are working to cut waste and increase recycling in London. The Mayor's already asked each of the London boroughs, we've written them to produce a waste reduction and recycling plan by 2020, and that will set out how they'll contribute to waste reduction and recycling targets. And in addition, the London Waste and Recycling Board are working with London boroughs through Resource London to help improve their recycling performance and to help improve efficiency. And that's really targeting problem areas such as recycling in flats and helping to undertake service reviews and how service reviews can be more efficient.
But in the absence of additional funding from government and in the context of reduction of funding to local authorities, without this extra money from us to support local authorities, is it really realistic that we're going to hit the Mayor's target of 65% recycling and reduction in food waste, or improvement in food waste separated collection? I really can't see how we're going to hit that with no money there to support the local authorities in what they're doing.
You're right, we want to work with the government, and we do estimate that we do need more money from government and from the spending review to help boroughs to deliver some of those targets. But meanwhile, we are working with boroughs to help them with reviews through the London Waste and Recycling Board to be as efficient as possible and look at how they can target problem areas to increase
So really
recycling.
to boil that down into one thing, then you're saying that really we need to see what comes out of the 6th December spending review before we can assess whether or not moving towards that 65% recycling target is actually going to start to really take place, because we are quite a long way away from it in many boroughs across London. I mean, really quite a long way away from it.
Yeah, and that's why we want to work with boroughs, and we're writing to all them to set out what their waste reduction and recycling plans are, so we can work together and try and help them get there. But yes, we do need more support from central government, and to look at changes such as plastic taxes, as I've already said, and extended producer responsibility. So we do need to look at wider measures.
There was another area I just wanted to ask you about, which is something that we discussed earlier on at the beginning of the year in the Environment Committee, which is about the move by taxi drivers who do have a 15-year tail-off period before they're obliged to move over to the zero-emission capable taxis. And the target is to have 9,000 zero-emission taxis in use and operation by 2020. And yes, at the moment we have, well, it's not even 1,000 yet. You're projecting now 3,000 instead. What on earth is happening here?
The target of 9,000 zero emission capable taxis was agreed by the previous administration with the taxi trade, as you know. We are reviewing how we're able to meet the zero emission capable target, or the equivalent of a 45% reduction in taxi emissions. So we're reviewing that, and we will update you when that work is complete, which will hopefully.
Okay, but this is actually really quite an urgent matter. I mean, as you know,
that's why we're looking
Putney
at
High
it.
Street is home to the first of London's low emission bus zones. We've just started launching more across London, but Putney High Street is also home to 2 taxi ranks, which continue to keep air quality in Putney at levels that are still not good enough. And that's the same with lots of taxis all over London. Actually, it's not very good for the drivers, particularly in the summer when they sit there with their windows open and they are themselves swathed in fumes.
We're starting to recreate the Environment Committee here.
Sorry,
we move this on a bit, please?
What are we going to do to move it on from the 3,000? I don't think that's fast enough.
We are reviewing it, and we're reviewing how we can meet either meet the zero capable target or the equivalent of the 45% reduction. We will get back to you soon. We are reviewing that because it's, obviously we agree, and it's something that we are reviewing, and we'll write to you when we've got the.
Well, I think it's probably a concern to the Transport Committee as well, I should imagine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Right, we've got 2 members that I've seen, Assemblymember Berry, then Assemblymember Duval, and then I've got a couple of wash-up questions. Assemblymember Berry.
You didn't cover the cuts to the 2 energy efficiency schemes in terms of budget. Can you outline why that's going on? I know that the budget summary says there's going to be a new replacement scheme for the Renew scheme. Is that going to be a more efficient energy efficiency scheme and deliver just the same amount of carbon savings, or is that really just a reduction in what we're going to achieve with that?
Some of those, where you see the reductions happening on the capital budget, those were the planned when the programmes are going to come to an end, and we will review how those programmes have achieved and when we're going to, if and how we're going to put more capital in those in the future. So on the capital budgets, we haven't made any assumptions that those are going to be carrying on once programmes have ended.
The draft budget says the capital money is going to drop considerably.
I think Assemblymember, sorry, not Assemblymember Clarke, I beg your pardon. Mr Clarke wants to respond.
Just make a general comment on capital. In fact, is referring the committee to paragraph 2.2 in Appendix 4 of the draft capital plan, which says that nearly all of our capital programmes in the plan are funded by government grants. So the reduction in later years for some directorates, and particularly DE, is due to currently government-funded programmes coming to an end. We do expect it's highly probable that there will be replacement programmes, but at this stage, that funding obviously is not committed, and the outcome is unknown. So the capital programme, as it stands, does not include any unfunded programmes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was my question really. Where does the money come from?
And
Why
it
is
just
it
ties
dropping
across
so
to
much?
others.
It's not to say that not going to happen when we get there, but the government doesn't give us the degree of forward planning that we show in our budget documents.
We have a good assumption that we'll be able to carry it on, but we haven't put it in the budget documents because the money hasn't been confirmed yet.
The money that is there is money that's still the tail end of the old programme. There's no money assumed for the new programme yet.
Not in this budget, no.
Right, so that
Not
is
yet.
that is still the old programme that's tailing
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
And we would depend entirely on government to fund these programmes. We couldn't get money from anywhere else to keep them going or restart them.
Generally, with, you know, that's our main source of capital funding, other than, you know, specific schemes like the Northern Line extension, where we use things like where we can use the business rate supplement. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on that as the budget carries on.
Okay, Assembly Member Deval.
One-off money is an expenditure. I think it's an issue for the entire budget in terms of where we do that. But can you supply an assessment of whether you've reached value for money in spending that one-off monies? And if there's some analysis, can you share that with this committee? And lessons learned on expenditure? We might come back to that. That's not just down solely to you, but we do the performance issue and whether you think you had value for money in terms of what you spent that one-off money for. Then can I just go back to an earlier point I made to the Chief of Staff? So your narrative of your budget is actually it's not a cut, it's programmes coming to an end. Some of those are one-off expenditures. You've reprofiled some. I'm not clear where, but no doubt my colleagues might be able to tell me where you've reprofiled that. It might be very clear rather than me go through the tables around that. And on the capital side, it's a government cut or reduction, a programme coming to an end from their point of view. Cut, reduction, reprofiling, tomato, whatever. So that's your story about the environment budget. My question then to the Chief of Staff, do you not think, right, when we look at the pound, shilling and pence of a budget, it doesn't really do your man, the Mayor, any favours at all? Because I could ride a coach and horses and present this in a way from the figures that we've got that actually there's cuts going on here and actually you're not committed to the environment. Well, I know very different that the Mayor is very committed to the environment. So how, in terms of presentations of this budget, do you not pick that up from this technical process we're in of making the books balance and do it without selling your man short? Right? Which I think, you know, quite frankly, if I was the opposition, around at some of them, they could have a little bit of a laugh here, to be honest, because unless we had that question of coming through, all the information you've provided us looks like actually there's a cut in this budget based on the technical stuff. How do we get round that? How do you get round that? We have a shared view on this. There's a common cause. It just seemed to be a bit of a problem.
I mean, it's a very fair point. I think we've done some work in terms of the budget documents to try and improve the transparency, particularly around the staffing side, if I may say, and what we're trying to achieve through the budget. And so I hope the committee, just as a general point, would see this as a step forward from the format that's been used in previous years. But I mean, I also would absolutely, you know, accept there's further to go, and you know, feedback from all perspectives is very welcome. I think what this does is it sits alongside the quarter 2 finance report, which was published just a few days later, and actually probably we've done a better job there of actually setting out and saying, look, there are these big commitments. Yeah, the Mayor announced big pieces of one-off funding in February in the final budget when we knew what the business rates outturn was going to be. There just wasn't the time to work out what the profile of that spend would be across multiple years. And so, you know, that just wasn't really reflected in the 18-19 budget. And then that leads to these really chunky amounts in 18-19, and the profile is necessarily going to change as those profiles are applied, which we'll do at the end of Q3. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's an issue there. I think in the, in the Q2 finance report, I think we did a reasonable job of setting that out and explaining that, but not in this budget document. I think one of the things that we might want to think about jointly with the committee is just looking at our timeframes, because we run to get the quarter 2 finance and performance monitoring out on 35 working days following quarter end. I'm pleased that we achieved that. I know the Chair has rightly challenged us and pointed out where we failed to do that, and obviously we're trying hard to do that, and I know it's important to Mary that and me as well that we do. But necessarily, the rush to get that done, that was following a little bit after the budget document, and they do to some extent have to be read together, because clearly when we think about the budget, we're thinking about the performance in each area, and maybe we need to try and think about next year trying to set our meeting schedule and align our dates so that we can look at that and we can present it a bit more transparently and clearly in the round.
Speaking personally, it is good that the monitoring reports are coming out earlier than before. At this stage in the budget process, I personally am more concerned about fact than messaging. I think facts can be interpreted in different ways, and I wouldn't want to sacrifice fact for getting the message right. I think how the mayor chooses to communicate his budget is a matter for him. But I think this committee needs to focus on the facts first. So there's no rebuke from me on any of that. There's a couple of tidying up questions that... No, there wouldn't be.
You want them to mess up. You want them to mess up and fall in their face. I'll have a different
Deputy
view.
Chair and I get on very well on these subjects. There's a couple of tidying up points I want to make on some of the answers we've heard earlier. And then we need to move on because, members, we've got 8 different sections still to go through, and we've done 3 in an hour and 10 minutes. So I just want to put that one on your agendas. The first one is the £100 million that was asked for in the Mayor's letter to the Chancellor pre-budget. What exactly would that have been spent on? The reason for the question is that recycling is a matter for the boroughs, and it is a matter for, in some cases, the joint waste disposal authorities. It is not a matter for City Hall. So £100 million is a large chunk of cash. What would you have spent it on?
In terms of the, I mean, there's...
It was a request, Chair. It was just looking at the annex that was sent to the Treasurer.
Yeah.
It says funding for London local authorities to maintain current road service.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
yes. It is for the boroughs to help them deliver more.
I think we're going to need rather more detail than that because, as I said, it is a matter for the boroughs. The boroughs have contracts relating to this.
Precisely.
Which they're locked into. Often they're very long-term contracts. It's something that the Assembly has kicked around a very long period of time, looking into why boroughs, for example, recycle at different levels. So before criticism is thrown around, it would be interesting to know exactly what the Mayor envisaged that being spent on and a breakdown. So I think maybe that's one of the things that we'll sweep up in the follow-up letters.
Yes, I mean, we've got the... I mean, we've done that research and that's the amount we've come to, so we can give you detail about
The second question is relating to an answer that you gave right at the beginning of this section to Assemblymember Cooper when you were talking about one-off revenue spends. So not representing it as a cut, but it was a spending one-off. So, for example, the £2 million revenue that was spent on water fountains that's not being replicated next year. Again, what would you have spent that on?
Sorry,
you said, because Assemblymember Cooper challenged you over what appeared to be revenue cuts to your budget. And you gave some examples of where there were one-off revenue spends in the financial year that's just drawing to a close. One of which was £2 million on water fountains.
Yep.
What did you spend revenue on relating to the water fountains programme?
That is being, so that the money hasn't been entirely spent yet, so the programme is starting now. We've just announced a partnership with Thames Water, so we're bringing in around, it's going to be a programme that's around £5 million, so we need to profile that spend as to how it's going to deliver over the next 2.5 years.
But what was it spent on? Research, staffing, what?
It's a combination of delivering the water fountains, staffing to get it there, working with the boroughs, grants to boroughs, etc., to get the things in place.
Okay, so the water fountains themselves, though, I would have thought that would be capital, not revenue.
So the Mayor allocated a total fund for the water fountains work. That was kind of unencumbered money, so it was revenue funding, went into the budget on that basis. Some of that revenue funding will be used for capital expenditure, or grants to other organisations who are then using it for what we'd regard as capital purposes. Right,
so it's likely to be grants then, because I could understand why you'd have one-off. So I've got some members in my. I can understand why you'd spend one-off capital sums. I'm struggling a bit with one-off revenue though.
Well, I guess the fundamental point is it's not GLA officers who are going round working out the sites, liaising with all the local people, getting it built. It's it's very much kind of grant and contract funding to the skilled third parties to do that.
So the additional business rates, in February is revenue. So we increase revenue budgets, but you can use revenue budgets for capital expenditure.
Yes, I understand that. But I'm asking, is that what happened in this case? I'm not getting a terribly clear answer.
I think
it is being reprofiled because we've only just gone into the partnership with Thames Water. We need to reprofile. It hasn't appeared in the budget, so exactly what the profiling is going to look like yet, and we're still working with our finance colleagues on exactly what the breakdown and the expenditure will be over the next 2.5 years.
But that's in the future, and what I'm asking about is the past. So I'm asking about how you can have one-off revenue spends that you're not having in the future and that not be a cut. And I think that I'm using this as an example to get underneath the approach that's being taken to setting the budget. Because when you set a revenue budget, there are opportunity costs for what you decide to spend money on, therefore what you decide not to spend money on. So I'm trying to get underneath the thinking that goes behind this. If you said it was a one-off capital spend, I completely get that. If you're saying that actually in some cases we're using revenue to finance capital, I get that as well. But what I'm getting is a slightly confused message.
I think, Chair, it's probably helpful just to step back. I know when you deal with TfL, you look at TfL revenue expenditure, and that includes things that we all would regard as capital, but because, for instance, the boroughs carry out the work, under accounting standards, TfL have to treat it as revenue. I think the fundamental point that you're making, which is the right one, and I know we've agreed about this before, is that you mustn't spend recurring items that are going to recur year after year after year from a one-off pot. If it's a one-off pot, you need to be clear that it's a one-off pot, which I think the Mayor was in February when he announced how the additional business rates money would be used. And then what we need to do is we need to find a way of setting out that clearly and, noting Assemblymember Duval's challenge, try and find a way how we can show that, which gives an accurate reflection of, what is the ongoing budget and what is this additional one-off spend and how that's profiled.
Okay. Now perhaps, because I'm conscious of time, having just told off the rest of the committee, I can't indulge myself too much. Perhaps we could sweep this up in the exchange of information after the meeting. We're going to move on now. Assemblymember Hall.
Okay, let me see if I could just ask a couple of questions about London and Partners. What exactly did London and Partners do with the extra money you gave them last year?
I mean, you've summoned a lot of information about what London and Partners did in 16-17, so we've given you all that information. In terms of what has been done in the year to date, they've been very much focused on working in the light of Brexit. Their Brexit and their key accounts team has been tasked with working with London businesses as much as possible to influence the balance of location, both for talent and to make sure that we retain businesses themselves so the location is maintained. So there's been a lot of work going on post-Brexit to make sure that we maintain talent and businesses. They've extended their international footprint. So they've opened new offices abroad, they've created additional 16 posts, and they've opened offices where they had no coverage before, so Paris, Berlin,
that's
Chicago,
the day-to-day running. We understand that. I mean, was there anything specific to the additional money that you gave them?
The additional money, the additional 1.3, was very, very much focused on dealing with any implications from Brexit. So that's what the additional money was specifically for.
So what will they stop doing then after the proposed reduction in their funding?
The funding is set to stay steady for the next 3 years. If you look at the budget.
Right, I had it indicated that it was reducing.
Steady.
13.1 million for this 1920 and the 3 years thereafter.
So that was agreed as part of the business plan, and it's staying steady for the next 3 years.
Okay. The London and Partners was originally set up with the intention of it gradually requiring less and less taxpayer funding as it went along, so it could support itself. Clearly that's going horribly wrong. I think it's a good idea that it does look after itself more and the taxpayers aren't looked upon more and more. What are you doing to try and encourage them to start performing better as a business in order that they won't need taxpayer funding so much?
We're working very closely with them to do that. We've recently, as you know, they've got a new business plan and they've been setting new targets, which have got a lot more, they're a lot more robust methodology calculations behind them. One of those targets is a proportion of resources that are non-GLA grant, and the target is that we want NMP to get a minimum of 50% of non-GLA grant. So we're working with them to do that. And there's a number of things that they're doing to look at their expenditure in other ways. They've got a fair amount of in-kind support, which means that they can reduce their expenditure. So got in-kind support through other offices available, and they're working with their partners to get as much additional support in as possible.
Yes, I mean, it's always been the case it was 50% though, wasn't it? It's not, you're not reducing that, as in that we should be putting in less and less and less as we go along. And the other thing that's
a target we've set for them because we think that's a target that's achievable.
Yeah, but you're aware that some of the other 50% is made up of taxpayers' money as well in European funding, etc. Do you think that's acceptable?
I believe that the LNP are carrying out and meeting their targets that we're setting them. So they're currently for quarters 1 and 2, they're overachieving their target is set, and we're working with them well.
You think you are working with them well?
Yeah,
that's,
I think that especially their new business strategy focusing on 7 core
millions of
markets.
Taxpayers' pounds are going into this particular company. Do you think it's right that the Economy Committee actually had to summons some of the information in order for us to look at properly what's going on in their business? Do you think that's acceptable?
We've provided you all that information, and we'll work with you as closely as possible.
That's not actually what I just said. Do you think it's acceptable that we had to go to that in order to get some information when so much taxpayers' money is going into London and Partners? Do you think it's acceptable that we had to go to those lengths?
We've provided you with all that information. Hopefully it will give you exactly what you want to know. We've got a new new structure in an LNP. We've got a new chief executive who's working with us very closely, and we want to move forward, and we'll provide you with
information. I'll ask Mary. Mary, do you think it's acceptable that we've had to go to these lengths to get information out of a business, if you like, that is having so much money given to them from the taxpayer?
The GLA body.
I think it was unfortunate that you had to summons them.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. But I think that there were difficulties set the new chief executive in providing the information, given the confidential context in which a lot of that information had been gathered, both in terms of board minutes and confidential data related to the companies involved. So I think that's what held back the handing over of the information. As you know, they have now handed it over. They are very concerned about the confidentiality of a lot of that information, but they have handed it now to the committee in that light.
They've handed it over, Mary, because they've had to.
Yes, no, because they've been summoned.
So,
I accept that, but I think there were concerns about confidentiality. That those have now been overcome, and they've handed over the information as asked.
Yes, because of course there's concerns from us as to how they make claims that they're worth £350 million to the London economy, and we want to drill down into how they come to that figure, which is not unreasonable given that millions and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is going into them. But I know we're stuck for time, so I'll carry on. But nevertheless, I hope the point is made. We're very irritated by this.
Assembly Member Hall, before we move on to the economic development questions,
About to.
I've just seen Assembly Member Pigeon, I think, on
Okay.
this subject, so then
Yes,
we'll come back to
fine.
you.
Specifically on London and Partners, in the performance paperwork we were given, it shows as a red indicator there is increasing evidence that tourism numbers are suffering, with predictions of further falls in domestic tourism and from key markets. So what I'm wondering is, what targets are there in London and Partners' business plan for the coming year, and what money are they spending out of the 13.1 million to try to reverse this trend in tourism dropping?
I can get you some of that. I can get you some of that detail and write to you in detail. In terms of the leisure tourism KPI, the activity is evolving significantly, and they do want to look at a different way of measuring, which I think is mentioned in the Q2 report as well. What they're going to do is they're going to use this year to set as a baseline for the GVA targets for leisure tourism. And they're going to report on results from activity by the end of full year 18-19. So we can write to you a bit more detail about that, but they did want to, with their new chief executive and the way they're going in, they wanted to re-look at the KPIs and the way they did targets.
Okay, do you know how
so that's
much
going to
money
be-
within their budget is going to be spent on tourism and trying to get tourism back up in London?
I haven't got that detail.
But
I
you
haven't
can
got that detail,
provide
but I can
that.
get that for you.
Thank
Yep,
you.
I can get that for you.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next section. Assembly Member Hall again.
Okay. Lucy again, why are the revenue budgets for regeneration and economic development going down so much this year?
Again, we're not. It's a presentational issue. So in terms of the regeneration budget, that's mostly due to movement and reforecasting from the previous year. So there's amount of slippage from the Good Growth Fund of about 0.4 million, from the Growing Places Fund of 0.9, and I can give this to you in detail. Skills for Londoners of 0.8, and FE Capital of 0.4. There was a one-off payment for economics fairness of 0.5 million, for programme 0.5 million. And then there's been various reprofilings across the year. So it looks like there's a decrease of 7.3 million. But that's due to some slippage from the previous financial year and programme reprofiling. The nature of a lot of the work that the regeneration team does, it's capital based, and the revenue supports some of that capital spend, and some of the nature of capital spend when we're doing big complex projects, some of those do slip over financial years because of planning permissions or just complexities in delivering those, and the revenue spend follows that on. So, but you can see in the quarter two reports as well where that's been made up of.
Possibly worth just noting, Chair, that's why I was so keen to see the regeneration performance stuff going, and we've added regeneration in to performance monitoring from Q2, because, we are very beholden to the external parties who are actually doing these regeneration projects and the issues they hit and the timeframes they run to. But I think it's important that we have really good, clear monitoring about that, so that we can keep a focus on what's going on and ensure that we get the benefits as quickly as we can.
Okay. And we do have very clear monitoring processes in place across the directorate, programme level controls at AD level and my level, and at project monitoring level to understand where that expenditure is and when things are going to be met. And over the past year or so, we've got much better at working with the groups that we're giving grant funding to get them into contract much quicker and understand what the drawdown of their spend is, so we can profile much better. And I think you'll see that some of the previous projects, there has been some slippage, but it's much less now for the new funding through the new growth deal and the Good Growth Fund. We have got much better at that in terms of working with the groups that we fund to get delivery.
Why is there no specific digital skills programme anymore?
Sorry, can you say it again?
Sorry, why is there no specific digital skills programme anymore?
That programme has been profiled and it's planned to become to an end. As you see in the document, we will need to discuss if we move that forward. But that was always meant to be a 3-year programme. That was what the plan was for.
So has the Mayor's priorities changed?
We need to look at that programme and see how it delivers and assess it. It's not that most priorities have changed, but we need to assess it, see how well it does and decide if there's a new programme, what the new programme looks like. So it's the first time we've done this and we need to assess it and see how well it looks.
And so will
how
funding be put
forward.
to that if you see that it's done well? Will you find funding for that going forward?
That will be something to discuss in new budget rounds.
Okay, Assembly Member Duval, and then we're going to move on.
Just very quickly about transparency about one of the programmes in the economic development. So there are sets of targets and measurables for the Good Growth Fund projects in the GLA website, but when you think about the objectives of individual projects, how's the GLA tracking these projects? Is a value for money issue, and how can members of the communities be involved in this information to hold projects accountable? And I was looking at this issue and trying to find out who takes what decisions. Are they subject to director decisions in that rather than mayoral director decisions around Good Growth Fund? What is the transparency about the money and who's doing what?
In terms of the Good Growth Fund, there's a dual governance process. So the Good Growth Fund is money that goes via the LEAP. So everything goes to either the overall LEAP committee or the LEAP investment committee, depending on the amount to spend. There is then also mayoral decision forms or director decision forms, depending on the amount to spend.
I tell you now, there's no mayoral direction forms, because I've been looking at some various projects. So
there is a mayoral decision form for the overall programme, and then when the rounds are agreed, it goes to the LEAP Investment Committee and the LEAP Committee, and then the individual projects are signed off by a director decision form. Because the overall programme, yes, the overall programme.
Right. Okay, so do I get access to that LEAP agenda, and is that confidential, the investment? Do I, as an Assembly member?
The LEAP investment committee papers are public, but some of the appendices are private if there's commercial sensitivities on who we're giving the money to. But most of them are public, yes.
Okay, and the assessment about value for money, where are you on that? About their spend? I mean, I know it's a fairly newish programme. Are they doing well? Are they not performing well? You give a sum of money to someone that deliver for you. Who's doing that work?
That's done by the regeneration team. So we've got a very strong and close monitoring in progress with all the projects that we give money to. There's regular progress meetings that we hold to check people are meeting their milestones, their outcomes, and that delivery is achieved. And that there's always a big part of the revenue funding is to do independent monitoring reviews at the end of the project to check they've met their outputs and their outcomes and they're giving value for money.
And then lastly, just a very quick question. Look, I know the budget and we're trying to plan for the future and all the rest of it. Brexit, and I know, government have not shown their hands on those issues, but whatever decision is taken by HM government around that, there's going to be a need to support at least small and medium-sized businesses in London. You've taken some steps in the existing budget, but there's nothing there helping people in transitional arrangements or supporting those. Should we not be thinking about this budget in that way? Do I ask you or do I ask the Chief of Staff? What's the thinking about this?
Is there anything from LEAP discussions that you want to start with, Lucy, and then I can add on?
Obviously, we've got the LEAP's got the. We're putting a lot more funding into the growth hubs, which is specifically support for SMEs and small businesses across London, and we're putting a lot more investment into that. And we're looking to improve the model there as well, so we have a lot more face-to-face support. So, I mean, that's obviously one key thing. We've also, as part of the Growth Hub, we've set up a portal that provides information to businesses, because we've been having discussion with businesses about what they want to see in the light of Brexit, and we've put a portal that gives information and access to support around Brexit and what's happening, and which we will continue to update over the coming months, which is what businesses have asked for, so we're doing that as well. We will look to react as necessary and provide support as we move forward, but we've got the processes and the programs in place that we can do that.
Thank you. Okay, just before we move on to the final section for you, Lucy, you're about to be able to take a breath. I've just been informed that we might have a fire alarm in a moment, and if we do, we may have to evacuate, which is spectacularly unhelpful timing, but it is what it is, and if it happens, just be aware that we may have to go and stand in the cold for a little while. Right, adult education budget, Assembly Member Pigeon.
It'd be no different from being in here, quite frankly. Budget cuts are hitting here already. I wanted to ask you, Lucy, about adult education, which is really, really interesting. It's coming to City Hall. Funding doesn't come till August, and we don't have that firmed up yet, exactly what it will be. But what are you looking to do with the new budget for adult education that wasn't happening before?
We've set out our ambition to move towards outcomes-based commissioning rather than simply just funding qualification outputs is one of the changes we want to make. And this is going to help ensure that providers are working with the aim of learners progressing into employment specifically. So that's one area we're looking at. We also have flexibility over how the AEB is going to be prioritised, commissioned, funded and delivered. Meaning that we can use the AB budget to support the needs of London specifically, so we've got a lot more flexibility about that. We're launching procurement of around 65 million of programmes which are going to be funded by the European Social Fund, so we're using about 10% of the budget to openly procure, and we're matching some of that with ESF funding, which means we can provide additional investment for skills and employment support for young people and adults. And it will also help us, specifically the ESF element, will allow us to support programmes with various groups who are becoming at risk of becoming NEET, parents, young people with learning difficulties and disabilities, and homeless people with complex needs, so that's another change as well. We have committed to a general principle of provider stability in the first year of delivery, so what we don't want to do is cause issues and difficulties for providers. So some of those changes are going to come in the future, but immediately we're going to make the AEB more accessible to Londoners by expending funding to a couple of groups. One of those, we're going to fully fund those in work and earning less than the London living wage, and we're also going to provide funding for any 19+ learner whose first language is British Sign Language to get a first qualification in BSL up to level 2. So those are just some of the changes that we're going to put in.
So it's interesting, the first year you're planning to keep the providers stable, but I remember going to a briefing and it was quite extraordinary how much money for further and adult education in London was being spent on institutions outside London. Will you be looking to try and make sure that this funding is delivered directly by London providers in our communities?
There are a lot of providers that we work with. I think rather than looking at exactly where those providers are, we want those providers to be the most innovative and provide the best results for Londoners, and to provide the skills that Londoners need and the skills that London businesses need. Okay. And within, I mean, you list out lots of details there, but will there be funding for retraining adults? Because I'm very conscious, Brexit for a start, but other things that adults need to retrain. Will there be funding to support that? Funding for adults to retrain?
Retraining adults, they've had a career in one area, I don't know, financial markets, and suddenly we may be losing jobs. They need to retrain in something else. Will there be funding for that as part of this budget? At
the moment, we're focusing on those areas that I set out. So some of those priorities around needs, parents, young people, etc. So I can get back to you in more detail.
Younger people rather than
No. It's any age. So it's any age, but there's different. I won't go into all the details of it. There's different eligibility criteria, but it's any age. It's 19 plus.
Okay. All right,
So,
thank you. Let's look forward to more detail on that in due course.
So members, before we move on to the next section, 2 announcements. Firstly, fabulously, the fire alarm won't be happening, so we can all, instead of staying in the cold outside, we can stay in the cold in here, which is excellent. Secondly, we've just been joined by staff and pupils of Riverhouse Montessori School from Tower Hamlets. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to City Hall. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you'll find it fascinating.
I think, Chairman, we should ask, is there some kind of punishment for them to come and attend budget performance?
Yes, we're talking about money. It's very, very exciting. Right, we're going to move on to talk about the MDCs, and Assembly Member Pigeon is leading on this as well.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm going to start off with questions on the Old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation. Maybe Mary, David, you had this big bid in for the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and that basically is what you were pinning your hopes on to really kickstart the work at OPDC. It wasn't mentioned in the Chancellor's budget statement in October, even though you'd hoped it would be. Can you perhaps give us some information there on what impact this will have on the work at OPDC?
Absolutely. The story about that is obviously the government announced in the budget they'd supported TfL's HIF bid for Dock and Light Railway, and the 18,000 extra homes that will unlock. So that was really welcome, positive, and I was very pleased about that. The story with the OPDC HIF bid is just simply that it's a much more detailed bid, and it is taking the government and the processes they're going through longer to get through it. I know that I got an update last night from the OPDC Chief Executive. I know that process is still running. I know there was a positive government meeting yesterday, and so it's taking longer, but we're still hopeful for a positive outcome there.
Right, so it's just that it's so complex they couldn't do it within the timescale, but you're hopeful money will come forward shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth saying one of the things about this government compared to the previous one a couple of years ago is that they don't have quite the same focus on everything having to be announced in a fiscal set piece event, and
right.
So it can be done separately. And I know the Mayor has discussed this topic directly with the Chancellor.
Okay, but if the funding didn't come through or you didn't get all of the funding, I think last year we were told that contingency from the GLA would be available if the bid was not successful. So what is your backup plan? How much money have you got set aside if you don't get all or any of the money?
So it's firstly, we're absolutely not complacent about this bid at all, and I know OPDC officers have given some thought to alternative avenues they could pursue. While the HIF bid itself does require some cash flow support from the GLA in future years, which is in our kind of medium-term planning, we're not saying that we're in a position to in some way kind of replace the HIF bid or deal with that. I think what it is fair to
say, you're saying you're not in a position to.
Well, no, because if the Mayor was able to do it, the government would say to the Mayor, well, you go and do it then. So that's part of obviously the reason for bidding to government for this. OPDC do have some other thoughts and ideas, but based on the feedback to date in the process with government, it's concluded it's been a better use of our time to look at the next steps on the basis of the HIF bid being approved, rather than trying to look at the contingencies if it's not, just because of the positive reaction that the bid is getting, albeit it takes a while because it's such a detailed piece of work.
Okay, and when do you expect us to hear about that?
That's really in the hands of the government. I'm cited on the date on the next. There's one more internal hoop before it goes up to ministers. And what I'm not cited on is how quickly the ministerial decision-making process will happen, and then whether the government, after doing that, will look to announce promptly, or whether they'll have reasons, perhaps because they've got a few other bids running and they want to announce them as a collective, whether they'll hold back from communicating the decisions. That's very much a matter for ministers.
Right. Okay, so not clear on that. Let's look at, So you're just saying you're hearing positive noises, so you're really just hopeful you're going to get that money. If you don't secure that money or don't secure all of it, how does that set back the project?
Well, it's definitely going to be a challenge. There's no getting away from that. As I say, we've got, with reason, we're taking an optimistic view to the outcome of the bid and focusing our efforts there. The Mayor's always been clear that, there was the memorandum of understanding that we inherited that was a good basis in terms of the land, Network Rail land. The problem was there wasn't the funding available that there was with other development schemes. This obviously is a way to remedy that, and there's no getting away from the fact it's going to be challenging, and we'll have to look at the private sector landowners and working much more closely with them and potentially bringing the scheme forward in a slower way or a different way or some way that we feel isn't as ideal as we can do with HIF funding.
Let's look at LLDC, something that's we've spent a lot of focus on the different committees over this last year. We were told by the former chief executive that he was confident LLDC they could make an improvement in the London Stadium's finances. But we've examined closely the state of E20 forecasting. I think it's 15.1 million they're forecasting in losses this year. We clearly don't have a grip on how big the loss is every West Ham match day. The GLA is going to be providing 8.8 million more direct grant funding compared to next year. Is this what's needed to put them on a secure financial footing? And are we any closer to this long-term goal that LLDC won't be needed?
So in terms of, let's do the last point first. LLDC is explicitly, as a development corporation, it's a time-bound organisation. The Mayor's clear on that. LLDC themselves are clear about that. That's not subject of controversy at all. The question is, as LLDC moves towards completing its mission in terms of the regeneration of the area, how you move from the governance and structure we have today to whatever will come next. And I know that LLDC have started thinking about that. There's some initial ideas going to be discussed with their board this month. It's going to be a way before we get into all the detail of that, but absolutely the thinking is starting about that.
And what sort of timescale are we thinking that LLDC would be no more? 5 years, 10 years?
So we're not, I guess the first question is, it's not, is it going to be like one day LLDC's there and the next day it's not? It probably, let's say the work's still being done. At the moment, my expectation is not so much that, but more it will be a case of saying, okay, right, this aspect of our work is done. Okay, so we can, and so LLDC will perhaps over time gradually become a smaller organisation, and where some things will necessarily run into the long term, then we will need to think about, right, well, where does that sit? Does some of that responsibility come back to the GLA? Does a kind of a shell LLDC list exist and do that? Is there some other organisation that picks it up? And that's the thinking that's got to be done. The Mayor, I think, has previously answered questions from the Assembly on this and said that he's got an expectation round about 2024. That's very much something for LDC to focus on at the moment as they develop the thinking. What's really important, obviously, is a very well thought through plan that gets us from where we are to ensure that the success, and I do think it has been a success in terms of the regeneration of that area, is sustained into the long term.
An issue about the stadium, E20, the huge losses.
So the work is going on in terms of the stadium. There are clearly one or two things and areas of progress that have been played out in the public domain. There are things that are still necessarily going on in private. I don't doubt that you'll be talking to Peter and Lynn about that in more detail in a few weeks. In terms of the stadium is loss-making, it remains loss-making, and that does require the provision of working capital through LDC to E20 to deal with that. And so that's what you see in the overall capital picture and how we're handling that.
Okay. There's also, in looking at the financial report, Q2 states that LLDC loan funding is forecasting an overspend of 13.9 million against budget because of slippage from works relating to East Bank and park-wide infrastructure. Can you give us some more information on that?
So this is money they didn't borrow in 17-18 due to the works slipping into 18-19. So
it's not an overspend, it's just
it's not
a shift
overspending,
in
it's,
date.
it's timing changes.
Okay, that's fine. Last year we were told that money will only be lent to LLDC in good faith because on the basis they'll be able to repay it once they have a capital surplus in the financial year. Does that position remain? Does your good faith in LLDC remain unchanged?
I don't really recognise the word good faith. It's like a double lock. Is LLDC can only borrow if they believe they can repay it, so that's their decision. And we're only going to lend the money if we think they're going to repay. So at present, we have a long-term model for LLDC, and that long-term model shows surpluses when you get into the 2030s. But that reflects the length of time they're going to do all their developments. And the judgment that has to be made is what could impact, on those forecast surpluses. So you obviously got to take long-term forecasts on house prices, tender prices, and that makes you want to be cautious to have a sufficient margin. So we in a way reset this long-term plan formally each year, but it's something we keep under constant review. I have monthly meetings with the finance team there, and this is a standing item on there. So at the moment, both organisations, through their chief finance officers, have statutory responsibilities to ensure that the borrowing is prudent, is affordable, is sustainable. And that was one of the reasons last year we imposed a cap on what we think is the maximum, which we will review again in light of their plans, which will be formal plans we'll see at the end of the month. And that's why the GLA's own budget has ongoing money to directly grant aid, because we're not going to lend them money that they can't repay.
Pay back. Okay. In terms of LLDC being more efficient, obviously there's lots of different aspects to their work, but maintaining the grounds and stuff out at the Olympic Park is huge. But you've also got Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, which is another huge bit of the park, and they don't seem to easily work together and share contracts and things. Is that something you would consider pushing LLDC on to be more efficient in terms of some of those contracts to try and reduce the cost to the public?
Well, I think what I would say is that if you look at the contract LLDC has in terms of maintaining the park, then they've generated efficiencies on that contract year on year through a close focus on that. And so if we were to compare costs between LLDC and Lee Valley Regional Park, then obviously we would, we need to ensure we're comparing like with like. I'm not, to be honest, closely sighted on the relationship between LLDC and Lee Valley. I don't know, Martin, whether you've had any particular sight, and that is principally a question for Lynn.
Yeah, I haven't got any further information on that.
Okay, I'll pick that up with Lynn then, in terms of just looking at different areas they could make some efficiencies. In terms of the stadium, obviously there was the out-of-court settlement yesterday with West Ham and E20. That presumably will bring more finances in. Are you happy with that? Do you think that the stadium is now on a good footing, or do you think, and some say, that actually you should just sell the London Stadium and cut your losses?
So in terms of the settlement, as the Mayor's always said, we want everybody who uses the stadium to be successful. If more people are able to go and watch West Ham matches, that's a good thing. The West Ham fans present may sometimes query that, but let's be optimistic. I think...
let's not be over-optimistic.
Yeah, I think what is obviously important for us is firstly that where we're incurring additional costs, those costs are met by whether it's West Ham or anybody else, and secondly that we try and generate more income and take all the other steps that are needed to reduce the deficit that the stadium runs at. And what the agreement between West Ham and E20 does is it ensures that West Ham have the option of increasing capacity, and that if they take that, they bear the costs of doing so. And there is an opportunity for E20 to make some money from that, but the scale of it is not in any way going to be very significant against the size of losses the stadium is making. But clearly it's important to get that sorted. It's good news for West Ham, it's good news for us, and it's another sign of trying to change and trying to move the stadium forward. So you asked about sale.
Saying some people say that maybe you should just sell the stadium and just get rid of this ongoing loss.
So the mayor has been, as we've discussed in the past, the mayor took a decision that the ownership of the stadium was split between himself and the Borough of Newham, and that wasn't a sustainable solution in order to address the problems the stadium had, and that led to his decision to take control of the stadium. The reality is that the stadium is loss-making. The accounts will show there are onerous contracts in place in terms of both West Ham United and in terms of UK athletics. And the question in that sense is who would want to take it on. The mayor's been very clear about his purpose for the stadium. It is a great asset for London. Although the stadium may lose money, London undeniably gains when we're able to have these other events there, whether it's the World Athletics, whether it will be baseball next summer. Saw the adverts for that coming through London Bridge Station this morning. And that's definitely an asset for London and a boost to the wider London economy, which is very welcome. And obviously that benefit isn't captured in the LLDC or GLA accounts, but it's a benefit to London. Hypothetically, were somebody to come forward and make a proposition, then obviously that always would get considered, but it seems unlikely that somebody's going to want to take on a loss-making business, given the length of the contracts that are in place.
It's an issue that's raised a lot, and I thought we should put that on record. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of things on that. I mean, Baroness Brady, when she appeared in front of the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee a few weeks ago, made very positive noises in terms of saying that the relationship between West Ham and the LLDC was starting to improve, and she credited a lot of that to the new chief executive of the LLDC. Of course, yesterday's announcement was a major step in the right direction in terms of rebuilding the relationship between West Ham and the LLDC. So it's moving in the right direction, and we will, as you said, have lots of questions to Lynn when she does appear in front of us, because clearly it is a concern to members, and I'm sure it's a concern to the mayor as well. On the baseball, I want to ask you a direct question on that. I mean, it's a very exciting development. I will absolutely be one of those people in the queue looking to get tickets to go and see one of those two games. How much are they going to cost to stage?
So they should be broadly cost neutral. I don't have the precise report in front of me. Obviously, MLB are paying for the hire of the stadium. And they will carry a lot of the fit-out costs in terms of getting it ready for their event.
I'll get straight to why I'm asking the question, because I'm conscious of time and I'm not trying to trick you. My understanding is to host baseball there, we will have to move the seats in the same way that we had to move the seats for the World Athletics Championships. And one of the big savings that the LLDC have made is not having to do that this year. Yeah. If we have to do it again that time, it's going to cost an additional at least £4 million, isn't it?
No. So when you look at the stadium, for those who are not familiar, if you think about where the football managers and substitutes sit, that's the main stand, the west stand. That's where the home straight is in athletics. Yeah. What we moved this summer, we moved the north stand and the south stand, so the ones on the bends and behind the two goals. We did not move the east stand or the main west stand. We just took a few rows off the front. Yeah. And that was fine for athletics. It wouldn't work for blue ribbon athletics, but we, as people, if any of you went to the athletics, you see that worked. The difference for baseball is that you need to change the configuration of the main west stand, and so there's an additional cost to do that, which is reflected in the commercial deal agreed with MLB. You do not need to move the east stand, and it's the east stand because of, as those who know the stadium well will know, the kind of mid-tier that runs between the kind of where on the west side you've got hospitality boxes, on the east stand you've got extra seats which are on their own scaffold, and we don't need to move that east stand for baseball. So yeah, some of the reporting has, I'm afraid, been inaccurate about that.
Okay, so you're offering an assurance that it will be cost neutral. MLB will pick up the cost of moving the seats, or the cost of making it look like a Major League Baseball stadium?
So there is a fee for use of the stadium that MLB are paying, and the outcome of that, because obviously there's things about sale of beverages and merchandise and all that sort of stuff, and it's the deal for it's a 2-year deal is I don't have the figures in front of me, so I'm being a bit cautious, but it's broadly cost neutral.
Okay. I think we'll pick that up as well, because I think the fear is, David, obviously for the World Athletics Championships, that lasted, I think it's a week, and we had to have the major realignment of the stadium, and that lost loads and loads of money despite being sold out every day. This would be 2 days, and the fear was it would have to have the same kind of realignment of the stadium, and there's no way unless you charge sky-high ticket prices.
So to be clear, we are not moving the east stand, which is the really big and expensive one.
Okay. Well, I think what we'll do, we'll write and ask for the breakdown of that, because if it is cost neutral, then it's going to be terrific for London.
Yeah, maybe that's just something we could give advance notice to Lynn of, because we're straying now from the GLA budget into the LODC.
We are slightly doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on now. The next series of questions is going to be about housing, and Assembly Member Berry is leading on that.
Thank you very much. Yes, these questions to David, by and large. Obviously, you've got the bulk of the money that we spend in the GLA budget. There's loads. So, can I ask how you're getting on with your £4.82 billion and how well you're allocating that? I noticed the overall budget for housing and land does dip back a bit in 2020-21. Can you explain why that is, and how you're going to get on with actually spending the rest of it in the time you've got?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, it is a sizable budget, and over the last year, of course, it's expanded fairly considerably with additional affordable housing grants and other programmes that we might want to come to. Because it's both a large budget over a number of years, and because clearly these are very large and ambitious affordable housing targets associated with that budget, which comes with tremendous potential but also many challenges, we were very keen indeed to try and streamline our grant award systems to incentivise providers to stretch their own ambitions. And that's meant that we've moved to a system of standard tariff grants, and wherever possible we've encouraged larger providers to become strategic providers, which means that in return for more ambitious targets for their delivery, we are inclined to give them more flexibility about when they claim their grants. So we are effectively forward funding more of the programme in return for providers negotiating stretch targets with us. What that means in hard numbers is that we're now allocated to approximately £4 billion out of the £4.82 billion core affordable housing grant. So about £4 billion is now allocated in the programme, and that £4 billion, largely for the reasons I've just described, is associated with about 95,000 starts. So our starts target for 2022, as you will know, is 116,000. We've currently got allocations for about 95.
Yeah.
And I am confident that this side of Christmas we'll be making further allocations to take that 95 further. So I think at this point, in what is a large and long-term and very ambitious programme, I think we're actually in a good place in terms of where those allocations lie. There's an awful lot of work to do to land those numbers, but at this stage the pipeline looks quite encouraging.
Okay, so you're aiming to deliver all the target by the end of 2021-22, not 22-23, which is where there's quite a lot of money still in there. So you're going to allocate it by 2021-22, and they'll start, but then you'll still be spending money on them in 22-23. This is getting really hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that work? If they've started, you've not given them the money yet. You give them it on completion.
So the starts target, the 116,000 starts target, is March 31st, 2022.
Yeah.
So that's the date when we will or won't have met our target. But the money associated with that spreads beyond that, because we often pay completion tranches. So for units that are completing sort of towards the very end of that programme, we may well be paying grant out for the following year.
And when do you expect it all to be spent then?
Well, pretty soon into 2022-23.
Okay, so that's okay, fair enough. And then the dip in 2020-21, that is the end of legacy programmes while you're ramping up the new programme, is that right? In capital spending.
Yeah, and of course we'll, because as I say, we're trying to encourage providers to, get on with things and take their money early in return for increasing their level of delivery. We're looking to get more of that money out of the door as soon as we can in the programme. So there will be a dip towards the end as legacy programmes come to an end and that money is awarded. So hopefully that dip should be an encouraging sign that we're actually closer to delivering our 2022 target.
Okay. One of those things is the London Housing Bank. We've been asking about that previously. That just stops.
It does.
This year. Can you explain what happened with that money? Because we were supposed to spend more than we were assigned more than is in these budgets.
We were.
Yeah.
We were actually assigned up to 200 million for the London Housing Bank, as you may remember. This was money that MHCLG, or whatever it used to be called, DCLG I think it was at the time, said could be available for the GLA as a loan fund to housing providers. So this was effectively a loan from government that we would need to repay. So it wasn't grant funding, and it wasn't money that we were going to be allowed to keep. And the terms for the programme were really quite constricted. So the money had to be returned within 7 years. It was only available for a temporary intermediate rent type product. And it proved less than popular, I think it's fair to say, in the marketplace. A lot of providers said, well, it's all very interesting, but actually 7 years doesn't really work for us. A lot of providers said we can get access to cheap money, so the terms for this loan aren't as attractive as we hope they might be. We spent quite a long time talking to government about whether we could make the loan fund more flexible or recycle some of the funding. I'm afraid those negotiations really came to nothing, so we decided to end the programme. But we did, as you can see,
and I think you
make a
also
number
asked
of
the government
investments.
if you might use the money for something else. Did they just say
We
no
did.
to that?
They declined our suggestion.
Okay, fair enough. The other thing is the housing zones. The last loans go out in the year to come, the one we're planning for. And then you've got one more year of giving out some grants. That programme, I think you were reviewing it, you were potentially going to withdraw some of the funding if it wasn't working. Is that, you're spending everything you planned in the past on that still?
Yeah, I think we're confident that the Housing Zones programme will deliver its targets in terms of spend and in terms of outputs. We did do a review of all the housing zones last year. We were particularly keen to increase the levels of affordable housing in as many of the zones as possible. That went quite well. We were also keen to squeeze out those that were slipping and were unlikely to deliver to target. So a number had their provisional allocations withdrawn. We gave them a deadline. Some of those are rebidding for other programmes. But what you've now got in the Housing Zone programme, both in terms of loans and grants, are what we believe to be projects that are deliverable within the time frame that we gave. And as you know, it was a time-limited programme, which is why there's a cut-off in a year or two's time.
You'll be publishing the results of your review and the financial consequences of that for each of the zones?
I'm not sure that we've got a formal plan to publish.
It's really hard to get
review.
any information about the housing zones. As you
But
know,
we'd be very happy to, share the information from that review with Assembly members.
I mean, it would be useful to know because also there's learning there, and if publishing it might help other people.
Happy to do that.
Thank you very much. The other thing is the council homes scheme, which I think is called Building Council Homes.
Yeah.
At the moment, that's a new programme the Mayor's announced. In the quarterly reports, there's no, I don't know what you call it, profiling of that, of how you're going to spend it yet. You've just got a target. So what is your, when will you update us on that, and have you actually managed to allocate any money?
Yeah, so it's a fair point, but we didn't actually announce the allocations until the end of Q2, so we've not been able to do a profile because the timing just doesn't work. But what we will have, I hope, is at least a provisional profile for Q3. So we're working on that at the moment. So that should be with you, get my timing right, February, early New Year.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a bit more about the detail of how you're going to accelerate delivery, because one of the things in the details in the revenue budget, well, it isn't clear from the revenue budget where these people are going to sit, so I'm going to ask you about that now. You've got 30 new staff needed to deliver the increased and challenging housing and land development targets, is what's in the budget document here.
Yeah.
What are those 30 people going to do? What they're going to focus on? Will we get a breakdown later on of what the plans are for them to work on?
Yeah, so yes, you will, and obviously there'll be a detailed report coming to the Oversight Committee that will set all of that out. So, roughly speaking, the new posts will fall into 3 or 4 categories. So, category 1 is going to be frontline area operations staff. We have 3 area operations and investment teams covering the city. We want to enhance those with some additional capacity in order to identify additional sites, work more intensely with partners to land these quite challenging numbers. So that's where one chunk of the new resource is suggested to be. Another one is around the specialist land and development professional support that we need. Because we're moving into more complicated land-based strategies and programs, we need some additional resource there and capability for in-house professional property advice. So that's the second. The third area where we're looking to enhance capability is a bit of extra help with contracts and transactions, because again, a lot of our work now is tied up with quite complicated loans and recoverable investments of one sort or another. It's a lot more complicated than it used to be, so we want a bit of extra capacity there. And then there's also a proposal that will be coming to Oversight to look at recruiting some, if you like, entry-level posts. Not apprentices. We will continue to support the GLA's apprenticeship programme, but if you like, what in some quarters is sometimes called a graduate scheme. So we think it's really important for the GLA to demonstrate that we're an interesting, exciting place to work, and that we can take people on towards the beginning of their career, bright people that we can then grow and hopefully retain. So that's going to be another area. I think we think there's some interesting and some quite exciting potential. So this is not simply people who don't know what they're doing. This is people who can really contribute to the effort that we need to make.
Okay, thank you. Just on staff capacity and working on getting the you're aiming to get 66,000 homes delivered every single year in total, not just affordable homes. So these staff, you've identified that this year you're slightly struggling to support that in terms of housing support and getting things delivered. So you're struggling this year and therefore you're increasing the numbers, is that in terms of basic staff?
Well, I wouldn't say we're struggling. That sounds a bit negative. I think everyone's working flat out. There's no doubt about that.
No, that's what I mean.
Yeah, we're working flat out. And I think, to be frank, I think given the stretch that we've got over the next few years, that is not sustainable. You know, I think, you know, to put it into context, you know, as I think the Chief of Staff mentioned at the beginning, you know, our overall budget over the next 3 to 4 years has increased in just 12 months from around about 4 billion to somewhere between 7 and 8 billion is what we're anticipating now. So it's not far short of doubling. And to give you another piece of context, it's interesting that Homes England, the government's housing delivery agency, which is doing very similar work to us with very similar targets actually, currently has 750 staff. And in the next 18 months, if you read their corporate plan, they're looking to double that to 1,500. And if you actually look at that in more detail on a like-for-like basis and add in some of the things that we do that they don't do, like rough sleeping services, for instance, and take out some of the things they do that we don't do, it looks very much as though, you know, it's probably the case that we, if these growth proposals are approved, will have a team of something less than 200 people compared to an equivalent of round about nearly 1,000 people at Homes England. So, you know, it's interesting that that's the scale of growth ambition for the agency delivering affordable housing outside of London. And as I say, their targets are broadly the same as ours.
Okay. So you've outlined that what the staff will be doing there, and it's sort of bread and butter delivering housing things. There are a number of sort of more niche and interesting projects that are in the capital budget lines, such as, well, community-led housing, which in the capital budget line goes from 1.6 million up to 17.2 million next year, and then the 10.3 million the following year, and then down to 4. So what's that thing? Where's that money coming from, and what's it going on? It seems separate from the land fund, for example, that's buying.
So, I mean, two things on that. I mean, one is we've got our own community housing programme, and we're expecting to see that ramp up as allocations are made. But in addition, we are, I think, in the
innovation fund kind of grants.
Yeah,
yeah. About. So that's going to community-led housing through that budget line.
Some of it certainly is. And in addition, we are, I hope, very much in the final stages of negotiating the government's, or London's share of the government's community housing fund, which I think will probably be somewhere between 30 and 40 million coming to London of new money.
On top of the 17.1?
I think that's probably in those numbers somewhere.
Oh. Can we get some clarification on that?
I will double check for you.
Yeah, because if that is the government's, the expected amount from the government,
yeah.
It'd be interesting to know where the rest of that is going, because that doesn't add up to 30 or 40 million.
I can give you a breakdown of where existing money and potential new money is going to sit in the budget.
So those are not staff to encourage sort of more independent community-led housing. That's direct. The staff that you're getting in, none of them are going to be working on the sort of revenue side of community-led housing, like promoting it.
Well, yes, they will be. I mean, so that's quite. I mean, this is an important programme within our overall numbers, and so my frontline area staff and programme staff are certainly working on community-led housing schemes, and we have a dedicated officer who is looking after the community housing hub, which, as you know, is the resource, Pan-London resource, to try and help some of the front-end challenges that community organisations have to get to viable schemes. So it's quite an active programme within the team.
Yep, seems to be. The other thing I wanted to ask about was the small sites programme. That's kind of a 3-year programme, the current year, next year and the year after. There's quite a lot of money going in. Next year it's 4.7 billion. Can you tell us about that and how many homes you expect to get out of it in the period?
Yeah, so as you say, it's a 4-year programme through to 2021. And The budget allocation against that is just shy of 15 million. It started very much as a pilot programme because we were keen to see how things would run. So we set it up initially with TfL with a fairly limited initial run to see how things would go, because as colleagues will be aware, there's been a colossal decline in the SME house building sector. So we were keen to see whether there would really be interest in a small sites pilot. I think it went very well. Frankly, I think we got stronger interest in the initial programme than most of us were expecting. We got over 130 bids from, I think, 80 different organisations right across the SME sector. This was for the TfL sites. TfL were estimating just over 100 units in that initial pilot, and we're actually going to deliver 166, 60% of which will be affordable. So that's now led us into a second wave of sites with boroughs. So we've got 5 boroughs looking at 38 small sites, and in addition, TfL are now identifying a further 10 sites.
It's 38 sites from the boroughs?
Yep.
Okay, that's really useful. The boroughs have very challenging targets on small site home delivery, don't they?
Yes, very much so.
So this is going to have to increase in future, the idea that you would be spending nothing on it in future years will have to be revised, I guess, at some point.
Well, I think the reason it's nothing in the budget shown is because it is a 4-year, it's a fixed-term project, it's a fixed-term programme. But as I say, because we've not done anything like this before, if it proves to be successful, then it may well be that we identify further capital rolling forward to extend it.
Okay.
So I wouldn't take a 0 to mean it will necessarily remain 0 if it's a successful programme.
Glad to hear it. So my final question is about the land fund. There's 2 lines in the capital budget about land funds. One is the new land fund, MHCLG, and the other one is land funds. So I think, can you explain why those 2 things are separate? There's an awful lot of money there. So.
Yeah, so the land fund, as opposed to the MHCLG land fund, is the 250 million that we identified earlier in the year as a fund that we would look to acquire sites and possibly do joint ventures, but very much around unlocking land to get housing built, with the idea that would, as far as possible, be a recycling fund as well. So that's where the 250 comes from. That's, if you like, GLA resources. In addition, though, we've been negotiating with MHCLG around a number of funds that they have. One's an accelerated construction fund, one is a small builders fund, one is a small sites fund. There's a range of these fairly small programs, and what we are, I think, hopefully concluding with CLG is that we can effectively wrap those small programs together in a new MHCLG funded land fund. And that's where that budget line, that's what sits behind that budget line. So that will be additional funding that we can apply to very similar sorts of projects to the existing land fund. It effectively extends that land fund by another 486 million or so.
Looks like it. Can we see, or will you publish any details of any restrictions there might be on the MHCLG? I mean, look, they're listed separately, so it seems to me like there are different conditions on spending that money.
Yeah, we will. We are, as I say, in the final stages, I hope, of negotiating the arrangements. That will be subject to a memorandum of understanding between the GLA and CLG. So the terms of the funding will be very clear. And in addition, subject to a mayoral decision, there will be, formal approvals for projects that are drawn down against that fund.
Yeah. When will we get that memorandum of understanding? And
well, there's an MD being drafted as we speak, okay. So it should be in the system in the next few days, I hope.
Great, thank you. That's great to hear. So just about the final thing is about the St Anne's purchase, which is the first big one that's coming out of the land fund, and it is quite big. It's about, I think, 40 million is the deal that you struck for the hospital site there. Can you tell us how that's coming along? Does that represent the spending that happened in 2018-19, basically?
Yep, that's right.
And is that done? Is that through?
Yeah, very much so. So we've spent a considerable amount of time talking to Haringey Council and also START, which is the community organisation that's come together with a very keen interest in seeing a strong element of community-based housing at the St Anne's site. We have, again, got a memorandum of understanding with START, which is great, so we're working very closely with them. We will this week start the formal pre-market consultation to try and warm people up to think about coming and helping us to develop that site. Early in the new year, that will become a formal expression of interest and sifting brief, so at the beginning of the procurement process proper. And we hope to have a preferred partner appointed probably the middle of next year by the time we get through the process. And that will almost certainly be a partner that comes through the new London Development Panel framework. But the brief to them will be to work obviously with us and the borough, but very closely with START as well.
And there'll be some strong bottom lines relating to affordable housing and community-led housing.
Yeah,
in the tender documents.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at least 50% affordable housing, and we would hope to see more.
Okay, I'll continue to ask you questions about that. And none of that money is in the community-led housing budget line here. You're not counting. No. So there's not a split between those or anything like that. Okay.
Thank you. I've got Assembly Member DeVal, then we'll move on.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting about your benchmarking with the national organisation compared to the numbers that you've got. In a similar vein, are we any, and I've asked you this question before, are we any closer to some of your projects where we can identify that they're value for money, that actually they're not just delivering the housing units, but actually this is a good deal and everything else that goes along with it? Where are we on that basis?
Yeah, I think it's very good value for money. It's quite interesting actually. If you look at, it sounds like a lot of money. I mean, it's the thick end of £5 billion, so clearly it's a very large sum of money. But if you look at what is being delivered for that, 116,000 housing starts, that is really, I think, very good value for money indeed. And I think it's very good value for money when you look at it against what are now the national grant benchmarks. And I mean, just to illustrate that point really, 10 years ago or so, when I sort of started doing this job in a previous incarnation, grant rates in London were typically around about 50 to 60% of scheme cost, typically. So at least half of the money to build an affordable unit was paid for out of grant. Today, that's somewhere between 10–15% is a typical level. It's actually a really quite modest proportion of the overall cost of building housing in London. And that's because of two things really. One, because obviously build cost inflation has skyrocketed, and also because the underlying value of housing has obviously skyrocketed as well, which means that land transactions are very expensive. So the subsidy level required to build affordable housing is very considerable indeed, which is why for a relatively modest proportion of grant, we need providers, housing associations in the main, to really work very hard to develop other forms of housing to provide the cross-subsidy necessary. So typically on a scheme now, the cross-subsidy that a housing association provides from selling housing and exposing themselves to market risk is many more times the value of our grant, typically 3–4 times the value of our grant.
It's an interesting point you make, but some of that subsidy is cross-subsidy because you also give money to the housing association as well. We're not only sometimes using our own money, our own land on some schemes, we're also using some of the public money we've allocated to them of adding to it. And that's why I say, I think overall, it's quite an interesting assertion you make, and I'd probably agree with you. But when we come down to individual sites and the issue of moving around what's value for money, and yes, individual sites have different challenges to it, there must be a better way to assess whether it's providing good value for money in terms of signing up to it into provision of affordable homes, or what the Mayor desires, what the objectives are. Maybe we should return to this as a budget and performance committee, because we've talked about it for many years. I'm quite interested. I think we're getting, that's the best answer you've given me, David, over the many years.
Incremental improvement, thank you very much.
It's an improvement, but I think we just need to flesh out something a little bit more.
Yeah.
And, dare I say it, why shouldn't the GLA open itself up to some independent study about some of what we're doing, to be honest?
Okay.
But let's return to it.
Maybe something for the work programme going forward. Right, we're going to move on to the final section. And Emma and Sarah, who've sat extraordinarily patiently for an extraordinarily long time, now's your moment. First up is Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair. So the Mayor talks about making London one of the healthiest cities in the world. There's also, quite rightly, the emphasis on developing the public health approach to violent crime, emphasis on early intervention, which was the main news item on the news today about knife crime, the violence reduction unit. So given all this, all very laudable aims, why then does the planned budget for health, education, youth fall so drastically, something like around £15 million in 2021/22? I mean, does this send out contradictory messages? How confident are you that this level of budget is sufficient to deliver on the Mayor's health and education strategies? I mean, how are programs like the Young Londoners Fund going to be affected, which has a lot of positive publicity?
Thank you. And the Young Londoners Fund is the main factor in answering your question about why the budget appears to drop off. So this is similar to some of the other points that we've discussed. So when the Young Londoners Fund was put into the budget, it was put in as 15 million over 3 financial years. And then it drops out of the budget as currently set out, which is why you see that big drop off. We are going to be profiling the Young Londoners Fund in Q3 in order to give a more accurate picture of how that spend will play out, and it will actually be spending out until the end of 2022. So you will see those numbers shift when we do that profiling in Q3. And obviously that programme is being evaluated. We will be looking at the outcomes of that work. But you're right, I think it has been a really well received programme. We've had a huge amount of interest from community groups, from boroughs, from other partners, and we had 450 applications to round 1 of the fund, and we had young people taking part in the scoring process, which was really interesting and really important. And we've now made a number of grants in the first round. So we have made I'm just going to get the numbers right here. We have made 33 small grant projects totaling 2.4 million. We've made 66 medium grants totaling 9.4 million and 4 large grants totaling 3.8 million. So that first round is due to start delivery in January. But as I say, the profiling of that spend will be set out in Q3, and you will see that it will be profiled through to 2022, which is when the projects actually will finish delivery. To your question about the overall priority, you're quite correct. This is a high priority. We've obviously recently published the health inequality strategy. Once we take account of the Young Londoners Fund, the underlying budgets for health and education are basically flat, so they're continuing at current levels. And so yes, we are confident that we've got the resource to deliver the programmes that we need to.
Okay. A number of the projects that are set to be delivered in 1920, including accelerating the take-up of the smart infrastructure in the city, what resources are going to be committed to that?
So, shall I take this one? So the Smart London team within the City Intelligence Unit is working quite hard to pull together the activity that's been set out in the Smarter London Together roadmap, which you'll have seen. It has 5 connected missions that work across a whole myriad of different areas from a digital perspective and work across London and very closely with the boroughs. It has 1 full-time GLA officer allocated to it, but has been very successful in securing resources from across a number of different programmes externally. So the Sharing Cities programme is a £25 million Euro-funded project, which is about creating and ensuring take-up of smart city infrastructure, which includes things like smart lampposts, which not only shed light but also deal with air quality sensors and CCTV and other technologies. They've also secured £8.5 million from DCMS to deliver fibre networks across the tube, and the London Office of Technology is also being established with some contribution from the GLA, but also from others, work hosted at London councils to serve boroughs and encourage collaboration on digital products and services.
So it's one full-time post.
It's one full-time GLA funded post and a number of other posts that are funded by external funding. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, the smart lamppost is one that did catch our eye, and I think it might be a subject offline to explore smart lampposts. We are quite interested, but we are running out of time significantly. The final question, or series of questions for today, is coming from Assemblymember Cooper.
All of them?
Well, yes, it's section 6C.
I know. I want to ask you about the development of the KPIs for social inclusion. I mean, it's a very interesting area, and I mean, one of the areas that actually I'm a bit concerned about is the one about sport, where we have a target on Londoners actively participating or volunteering in sporting events as a result of GLA sports projects. And we appear to have no target, and we seem to still be having no target going forward. And I just wondered where we are with developing that. I don't mind whether that's Emma or Sarah who answers me.
Let me start and then Emma can chip in.
Fight amongst yourselves, absolutely.
Yeah, this is the joy of a job share.
There's no blood on the carpet.
No, obviously. So I suppose that I can talk a bit more broadly about the work we're doing to measure social integration, if you would like. On this specific question about sport, the intention very much is to set KPIs and to set performance targets in that area. So what you will have seen in the Q2 reporting is, for the moment, we've taken it out from the PI section and we're reporting on it against one of the deliverables at the moment. Now, that is because this is a new programme. It's trying to do something really different and really innovative, and we're developing the performance measures to make sure that it picks up these points about social integration. And we're doing that working very closely with the City Intelligence Unit, who are looking at these questions at a city level to make sure we get that read across from the project and the programme level to the city level objectives. So that work is underway, and that PI will be reappearing in the portfolio dashboards when we have the measures in place. The programme is only just getting started. So.
Okay. So, but when do you think that's going to be? I mean, I'm very sympathetic to what the Mayor is doing here and using culture and aligning that very strongly with economic development and using volunteering and sport as a result of GLA programmes and seeing that very linked to social inclusion. But I'm also not sympathetic to the idea of then not measuring how successful that has been. And I think it becomes almost impossible for us to justify when we're talking to people about some of these programmes if we don't have something that is a tangible measurement. Now, I know that that's also been something that you've been aware of in terms of moving forward on this type of innovative approach, and having a Deputy Mayor for Social Inclusion obviously is part of that approach. But we really do need to nail this down. So when's that going to happen?
I can come back to you with the specific dates of when we're going to have that PI back in the set. So what I would say is that the sport team are working closely with the City Intelligence Unit here on those measures, and they are also, of course, also working with the stakeholders and providers who are actually delivering some of these programmes. So it is quite a complex conversation, but I mean, we completely agree with you that there need to be rigorous measures here, and that's why we're taking our time to make sure we get the right ones. We could have put in some more sort of output-focused measures in terms of levels of participation, for example, but we want to set our sights higher than that and make sure that we have a really clear link to social integration outcomes, and that's just taking a bit longer. But we'll let you know exactly when that.
Okay, so that will be scooped up, I hope, in the letter backwards and forwards.
Yeah,
and can I just check that that's going to include some quarterly updates, because there seems to be an implication that we might just have annual updates on the various indicators. I don't think that's quite right. I think, we do need to be monitoring success, and obviously if you wait a whole year, your programme might be not being as successful as perhaps it should be. So I think having more regular updates is helpful.
So we will be doing quarterly reporting on the projects and on the dashboards as normal.
So there will be quarterly reporting.
I think there will be quarterly reporting. I think it's fair to say that there may be some kinds of data that it's only appropriate to collect on an annual basis and report on an annual basis, but that doesn't mean that the projects aren't going to be monitored quarterly.
So ignoring the one about active participation or volunteering in sport as a result of GLA sports projects, looking at more Londoners volunteering as a result of GLA programmes, and I'm a big fan of Team London, but looking at these figures, they do seem to, we seem to be lagging rather in terms of Q2, 18-19, just less than 12,000 people volunteering, and yet we've got these very big headline figures of 25,000 during 18-19. Are we definitely going to achieve that? And then 100,000 during 2020. Can you walk me through how we're going to get up from 12,000 to 100,000? That's quite a large increase.
So my understanding is that the 100,000 it's a 4-year cumulative target.
So that's cumulative.
So that's 2016 to 2020. I think that the team remain confident that they're going to hit their targets here because of the nature of some of the programmes. So, for example, London ambassadors are very focused in particular periods in the year. We don't see a totally smooth delivery of volunteering across the year because the programmes peak and trough at different points. There have been some delays in the reworking of the Team London website, which is obviously a really important tool for encouraging people to volunteer. I think in spite of that, the team have been working really hard and they are broadly on track to be meeting their target, so they're confident that they're going to meet their target.
Okay, well, I think it's really important that if we are going to, that we keep to monitor. Sorry, Emma, you wanted to come in.
That's right. Just to add in that the Euro 2020 contest, of course, will be a huge opportunity for Londoners to get involved in that competition, and there's lots of volunteering opportunities that will come out through that contest, which is not very long away.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit more about the London Family Fund? What measurable impacts do you think it's had so far?
So that fund is just getting started. So we've had a huge level of interest. So it was launched in March. We had over 270 applications from across the city, which I think demonstrates the level of interest there is in this question. And this is something really, really innovative, trying to look at those early years as an opportunity for social integration. So, we're not funding childcare through this programme, for example. We're really looking at how parents and families build those relationships. So we've now selected 9 projects, which we're just in the process of finalising the due diligence on those, but they will be getting going in January. It's a really interesting mix of projects looking at targeting different groups, but with all of them, the key thing about this programme is that they're focusing on building relationships between different groups of families who might not otherwise interact. We know that there are problems of segregation in early years settings. We know that different types of families are accessing different levels of provision and some aren't accessing much support at all. So that the unifying theme across those projects is very much those relationships, and the approach we're taking to measuring impact and evaluating impact will be looking at that question directly. So we're going to be speaking to participants about the relationships they build, about the kinds of people they're interacting with, and trying to look at whether those persist to the extent that we can within the scope of the project.
But well, clearly you anticipated my question, which is, again, you're developing some sort of KPIs for this type of work, which I think is really interesting. You're talking about links between different types of families. Is there also an intergenerational element to any of this work as well? Because that's become quite fractured in a number of communities, particularly in London, where we have a lot of people who've come here from other countries, and perhaps they've got older relatives somewhere else.
It's a very good question. I don't think that any of the projects have a specific intergenerational aspect to them, but as I say, they are about families. So obviously families involve people from lots of different generations. So, for example, I would be very surprised if there weren't grandparents involved in those projects as well as parents in a lot of cases.
And while on the subject of how welcoming we've been in London to people from all parts of Europe, we've obviously got the portal, which I think is very welcome. Actually, I was involved in a conference that was held here actually in the City Hall with Matthew Ryder. I think it was just as he was outgoing in his role, with some MEPs, and there was wide representation from a number of Eastern European countries, and people were talking about the online portal. Are you surprised at the level of access that's already been noted? I understand it's been fairly well used up to now. Are you anticipating that it's going to be maintained at a level where it's going to be able to withstand additional accessing by members of the public? Because obviously I would have thought over the next 6 months or so that there might be added interest in accessing the portal for information.
Yes, I think we haven't been surprised, because the reason we set this up was that we knew about the huge levels of demand for people from information in obviously a time of great uncertainty. So we've planned for those high levels of access. I'm just pulling out the exact numbers. So we're aiming to reach 100,000 people through the portal. So that's what we're planning for.
Well, we're not aiming to reach it, but we're hoping we can cater for, should they wish.
Well, I think the hope, that's the target we've set ourselves in terms of the number of people who we hope will be using and accessing those resources. We know that there are roughly 1 million people in London who are affected by this situation. It's also worth noting, I think, that the work around the portal is not just the online resource. It also includes a programme of community outreach, working directly, particularly with the most vulnerable groups. And I suppose what I would say is that we're really focused on making sure that all Londoners get the information that they need, and we are very aware that for some Londoners that is much more complicated. And so there is some really targeted work going on behind the online portal to make sure that we're supporting civil society groups who are working with particularly the most vulnerable groups who may otherwise be left out of this process.
And it will be updated regularly. You've got staff on hand, yes, as various pieces of information are revealed, because obviously with that level of complexity it's important to make sure that the advice is there and it's accessible so that people have the most up-to-date information when they want to access the portal.
Absolutely. So we are actively updating it as soon as the government releases more information about their scheme. We're also directing people to sources of information and advice on the ground, because we know that for a lot of people it won't be enough to just know what the government's latest position is. They will actually need some direct support. So the portal is trying to make sure that people can access that more sort of in-depth information and support.
So signposting them to others who are able to give them more in-depth
because we will never be able to give everybody all the information they need on the portal. So it's trying to strike that balance.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end then. It's been quite a long morning, but a very informative one. So can I thank all of our guests for the answers that they've given to us today. There will obviously be some continuing dialogue in writing. Members, can we note the report on today's discussion?
Noted.
Item 6 is the committee's work programme. Can we agree the work programme as laid out for the remainder of the year? The date of the next meeting is Tuesday the 11th of December at 10 o'clock in this room. Any other urgent business? There isn't any. It's time for us all to go and thaw out. So thank you all very much. The meeting is closed.
GLA